Hey there. Tonight we're diving into the gleaming, gold-capped world of ancient Egypt. You know the one: magnificent pyramids, godlike pharaohs, and hieroglyphics that make your grocery list look basic. But beneath that postcard perfection lies something most tour guides skip over: human trafficking, the dark foundation that held up those perfect pyramids. It wasn't just occasional, it was institutional, systematic, normalized. The Egypt you learned about in school was basically an Instagram filter on a crime scene. Beautiful, but deceptively cropped. Because while you were admiring those massive monuments, someone forgot to mention they were built by people who didn't exactly fill out application forms. People owned people back then. But this wasn't some footnote in Egyptian society. It was the economic engine that powered everything. Before you get too comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy historical nightmares disguised as bedtime stories. Drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from. I'm always curious which corner of the modern free world is learning about ancient bondage. Now, dim your lights, fluff that pillow, and prepare to feel uncomfortably privileged as we journey back to a time when your resume might just be property of Amenhotep, good at carrying stones, doesn't complain much. You're walking through the streets of Thebes, not as a tourist with a selfie stick, but as a human being with a price tag. Your value isn't determined by your dreams or talents, but by how straight your teeth are and whether your back looks strong enough to haul limestone. The market inspector pokes your ribs like you're a suspicious melon at a grocery store. Too thin? Worth less. Too old? Worth nothing. Too educated? Potentially dangerous but valuable to the right buyer. This isn't some niche black market operation happening in shadows. It's broad daylight commerce conducted right next to where people are shopping for dinner ingredients. The same merchant selling you papyrus might have a side business in Nubian children. Ancient Egyptian society didn't just tolerate human trafficking, it required it. You weren't born into this life of bondage. You had a home once, but then Egyptian soldiers arrived in your village with chariots and bronze weapons. Your entire community became not casualties of war, but its actual objective. Because while gold and cattle were nice bonuses, the real treasure was people. Portable, profitable, self-replicating property. The monuments still standing today weren't just architectural achievements. They were profit centers, built through systematic exploitation. That perfect limestone block alignment didn't happen because workers were passionate about pharaonic vision boards. It happened through meticulously organized human suffering. So as you drift towards sleep tonight, remember that history's greatest wonders often hide its greatest horrors. The same hands that built immortal monuments belonged to people whose names were deliberately forgotten. People whose stories deserve telling just as much as the kings who claimed credit for their work. Because when the sandstorms of time clear, what remains isn't just what was built, but who paid the price for building it. And that's the side of ancient Egypt your museum tour guide conveniently ran out of time to mention. Humans weren't Egypt's first commodity, but they quickly became its most profitable. In a land where gold flowed from conquered territories and grain filled massive storehouses, nothing generated wealth quite like owning people. The concept seems foreign to us now. We get uncomfortable just sharing Netflix passwords. But for ancient Egyptians, owning another human being was as normal as owning a chair. Only the chair complained less and couldn't plant your crops. Archaeological records confirm that by the Middle Kingdom, at least 15% of Egypt's population consisted of enslaved or unfree laborers, predominantly from foreign conquests. Historians still argue whether certain hieroglyphic terms referred to slaves specifically, or to a broader class of dependent workers, blurring the line between slavery and servitude. And here's something they don't tell you in documentaries. Some Egyptian elites were actually buried with miniature figurines of their favorite servants, like some twisted version of taking your emotional support human into the afterlife. You're standing in a crowded marketplace in Memphis. The air smells of sweat, fear, and desperation, sort of like a modern DMV, but with more honest signage about ruining your day. Before you stretches a row of people standing on wooden platforms. They're arranged by skill, origin, and physical condition. Their value isn't determined by who they are, but by what they can do. Therefore, the strong young Nubian man costs more than the elderly scribe. But the trained household servant from Canaan commands a premium because she knows how to properly dress Egyptian nobility without stabbing them with hairpins, a skill surprisingly in demand. A wealthy Egyptian merchant walks past you, scanning the human merchandise with the same casual interest you might show browsing streaming services on a boring Tuesday night. Too old, he mutters at one. Too skinny, at another. He's not being cruel in his mind. He's comparison shopping for a product. In this economic ecosystem, you're witnessing something beyond simple slavery. It's a sophisticated multi-tier system of human ownership that would make a modern corporate org chart look straightforward. Not all unfree people had the same status. Some were war captives, basically walking souvenirs from Egypt's latest military vacation in Nubia or Syria. Others were debt slaves, local Egyptians who made the unfortunate career move of owing money they couldn't repay. Instead of bankruptcy protection, they got lifetime employment without the employment part. The Egyptian language didn't even have a single word for slave until much later periods. Earlier texts used terms like servant, dependent, or just person belonging to the house, temple king. It's history's most horrifying euphemism contest. Imagine your LinkedIn profile just listing you as Dave, belonging to Pharaoh, experienced in not dying while building things. The pricing structure would break a modern economist's brain. A skilled craftsperson might be worth 20 deben, about 1.8 kikal, of copper, roughly the same as a small house. A field worker from a recent military campaign might go for 5 to 10 deben. Children, particularly girls who could grow into household servants or concubines, were especially valuable long-term investments. Ancient Egyptian financial advisors would probably tell you that diverse slave portfolios outperform government bonds over time. Transaction methods were surprisingly bureaucratic for something so morally bankrupt. Ownership transfers required documentation, papyrus receipts detailing the person's origin, skills, and purchase price. These receipts have survived, giving archaeologists uncomfortably precise data on human values. One particular text casually lists: one Nubian youth, 4,000 copper deben; one Syrian woman with child, 3,800 deben; 5 measures of fine linen, 200 deben. People and fabric listed with the same accounting detachment. Not all trafficking happened through public markets. Elite households often traded servants amongst themselves as gifts or to settle debts. Sorry about that unfortunate comment about your wife's wig. Please accept these 3 Hittite children as an apology. Problem solved, social harmony restored, human autonomy thoroughly ignored. For foreigners, entering Egyptian society through trafficking was often one way. Their names were changed, their cultural identities erased, their bodies physically altered to meet Egyptian standards. Some rose within the system, becoming trusted household managers or administrators. But trust came with control. Many were branded or tattooed with their owner's mark, a practice that makes modern corporate uniforms seem refreshingly chill by comparison. You watch as a family is separated on the auction platform. The father goes to a quarry owner, the mother to a weaver's workshop, the children to a wealthy household seeking domestic help. There are no tearful goodbyes allowed. Property doesn't get to have emotional farewells. The transaction is clean, efficient, and thoroughly documented. Bureaucracy has always been civilization's way of making atrocity seem orderly. Egyptian art tells the story too, though you have to know what you're seeing. Those small figures walking behind the noble in tomb paintings, owned people, the rows of kneeling foreigners bringing gifts to Pharaoh, tribute that included human beings, the workers shown building monuments. Many were unfree, but artistic conventions showed everyone smiling, because nothing says historically accurate like happy people doing forced labor under the desert sun. For most trafficked humans, there was no hope of manumission, no jubilee year to set them free, no path to citizenship. Their children would inherit their status, creating generations of unfree people. Their bodies would be worked until they broke, then discarded without the elaborate funeral preparations Egyptians created for themselves. In death, as in life. They remained outside the circle of full humanity. What makes this system particularly perverse is how thoroughly it was normalized. Religious texts, government documents, and private letters all casually mention owned humans with no moral qualms. The gods themselves owned people through their temples. How do you rebel against a system when even the divine powers endorse it? You'd think a civilization obsessed with justice and cosmic order would question the morality of owning people. But that's our modern lens clouding history's harsh reality. To ancient Egyptians, the stratified hierarchy of society, from pharaoh down to the owned foreigner, wasn't injustice. It was Ma'at, proper cosmic order. Some were born to rule, others to serve, and some to be owned. The universe itself apparently had an org chart, and challenging it wasn't just illegal, it was blasphemous. As the day ends in Memphis, transactions complete, you watch new owners lead away their human purchases. Some speak softly to their new property, others use whips and threats. Either way, the result is the same. Bodies moving not by their own will, but by another's command. Minds learning to suppress their own desires to anticipate another's needs. Souls gradually accepting that they exist as tools for someone else's comfort and prosperity. This wasn't some minor aspect of Egyptian civilization or a regrettable footnote. Human trafficking was the invisible foundation that made everything else possible. Those massive temples, those stunning tombs, those elegant papyrus scrolls filled with wisdom literature about treating others with dignity, all of it rested upon the bowed backs of people who had been commodified, trafficked, and exploited. When we marvel at ancient Egypt's achievements, we rarely count the true cost, not in gold or resources, but in human lives consumed by a system that saw people as things. The pyramids weren't just built with limestone and copper tools. They were built with flesh, bone, and broken dreams. A monument not just to pharaonic power, but to humanity's endless capacity to normalize the unthinkable. War was Egypt's most reliable human supply chain. When the pharaoh announced a new military campaign, generals didn't just see battlefield glory, they saw inventory acquisition. Battle became a twisted version of modern corporate recruitment, except with more spears and significantly worse benefits packages. The army marched not just to conquer territory, but to harvest people, turning foreign lands into human resource departments with extremely hostile hiring practices. You're hiding in a Nubian village as Egyptian war drums approach. Your community knew this day might come, but knowing doesn't prepare you for the reality. The dust cloud rising over the horizon, the glint of bronze weapons, the organized rows of professional soldiers against your farmers and herders armed with tools. Therefore, the battle isn't really a battle. It's a collection operation. The Egyptians don't want your land, they want you. They've brought rope, not just weapons. They've brought scribes to inventory their new acquisitions, not just soldiers to secure territory. Records from Thutmose III's campaigns show he returned from a single Syrian expedition with over 7,000 captives, predominantly women and children, carefully categorized by age, gender, and potential usefulness. Historians still argue whether these massive deportations were primarily economically motivated, or if they served a political purpose in preventing rebellion by removing potential resistance leaders from conquered territories. As Egyptian soldiers overrun your village, they're following a well-established protocol. The young and strong are targeted first, prime working-age people between 15 and 35. Children old enough to train, but young enough to adapt. Women who can serve in households or bear children. The elderly and infirm, sometimes killed, sometimes left behind to manage what remains of the community. A kind of extremely underpaid management team overseeing what is now essentially an Egyptian satellite operation. The selection process resembles history's most terrifying performance review. Officers move through the captured, assessing value with practiced eyes. This one to the fields, they say. This one to the temple. This one might work in a noble household. Your fate is determined in seconds by someone who sees you as inventory, not as a person. It's like the world's worst talent show where X doesn't mean you're eliminated. It means you've been selected for a lifetime of servitude. Did you know Egyptian soldiers received bonuses based on capture quotas? A soldier who brought in 5 healthy captives might receive extra rations, better housing, or even a small plot of land. One quirky detail from a military papyrus suggests that captives with unusual hair colors or heights were worth double in soldier bonuses. Ancient Egypt's version of finding a shiny Pokemon, except with actual human beings and profound generational trauma. The march back to Egypt makes today's budget airlines look luxurious. Captives walk hundreds of miles, bound together with rope or wooden yokes. Those who slow the column face beatings or execution. Water is scarce. Food is minimal. Your feet bleed into the sand. Your shoulders burn under the desert sun. Children cry until they have no tears left. By the time you reach the Nile Valley, the person you were has begun to evaporate like morning dew under the Egyptian sun. But here's the brilliantly terrible part. Egyptian propaganda didn't call this slavery. They called it bringing the foreign lands to Egypt, or expanding the boundaries of Egypt. Military scenes in temple reliefs show captives being welcomed into Egypt. It's like calling a prison mandatory extended stay housing, or rebranding a crocodile attack as surprise dental restructuring. Once on Egyptian soil, you undergo processing that would make modern airport security feel like a spa treatment. First comes marking, tattoos, brands, or distinctive haircuts that identify you as property. Some captives receive cartouche-shaped brands with the pharaoh's name, officially marking them as royal property. Others get the mark of whatever temple or institution now owns them. Think of it as history's most painful employee ID badge, except you can never quit or take it off. Specialists trained in foreign languages begin your reorientation. You must learn Egyptian commands, Egyptian customs, Egyptian names. Your birth name, irrelevant. Your gods, forgotten. Your family connections, severed. You're given a new name, usually something degrading or simply functional. Nubian girl or Syrian field worker. Or, if you're lucky enough to work in a household, perhaps something poetically demeaning like foreign flower. Identity erasure isn't just a byproduct. It's a deliberate strategy to prevent organized resistance and cultural continuity. Children have it both worse and better. They adapt faster, learn the language more easily, and sometimes find slightly better positions. But they also lose their cultural identity more completely. Within a generation, they may not even remember where they came from. Their grandchildren will speak only Egyptian, worship Egyptian gods, and perhaps even look down on new captives from their ancestral homelands, the ancient world's most devastating example of Stockholm Syndrome. What makes Egyptian military slaving particularly perverse is how thoroughly it was documented. Scribes kept meticulous records. Temple walls proudly displayed scenes of bound foreigners being presented to pharaohs. Victory stelae listed human captives as resources acquired, right alongside cattle, gold, and timber. The 20,000 captives from a Libyan campaign weren't a moral problem. They were an accounting line, a successful quarterly earnings report written in human lives. The Egyptians weren't unique in taking war captives, but they were exceptionally systematic about it. Military campaigns were scheduled around agricultural cycles, not just to ensure soldiers could be spared from fields, but to hit foreign populations when they'd be concentrated in settlements during harvest time. Maximum efficiency in human harvesting. If Amazon designed ancient warfare, this would be it. Optimized collection routes with same-day delivery to labor camps. For captives with specialized skills, metalworkers, weavers, artisans, the transition could be slightly less brutal. Their talents made them valuable, which occasionally translated to marginally better treatment. It's the ancient equivalent of having a LinkedIn profile that catches a recruiter's eye, except the recruitment involves spears, and you can't politely decline the offer. If you were a foreign elite, a prince, princess, or noble, you might be treated as a diplomatic hostage rather than common labor. You'd be invited to live at the Egyptian court, receive an Egyptian education, and be thoroughly indoctrinated. Years later, You might be installed as a puppet ruler in your homeland, now thoroughly Egyptianized and loyal to the pharaoh. It's less trafficking and more involuntary cultural exchange program with a 100% graduation rate into collaboration. The psychological engineering was perhaps most impressive and disturbing. Captives were repeatedly shown the might and divine blessing of Egypt. Temples, monuments, armies, wealth, all designed to overwhelm and induce acceptance of Egyptian superiority. Religious ceremonies reinforced that the gods themselves had ordained Egyptian dominance. Military parades showcased the futility of resistance. Witnessing public punishment of rebellious slaves demonstrated the consequences of defiance. Some captives eventually gained limited status within the system. After years or generations, their descendants might become overseers of newer captives, minor officials, or skilled craftspeople with small privileges. The system created internal hierarchies among the unfree, turning potential allies against each other. It's like giving one person in prison a slightly less uncomfortable bed and expecting them to help keep everyone else in line. The legacy of these mass captures lived on for generations. Entire communities in Egypt descended from war captives, maintaining faint cultural distinctions even centuries later. Specialized neighborhoods of Nubian potters or Syrian weavers emerged, their skills passed down, but their origins increasingly forgotten. They became Egyptian, but remained separate, integrated enough to be useful, distinct enough to be controlled. When we look at ancient Egypt's magnificent achievements, we're looking at the product of repeated mass abductions, engineered with bureaucratic precision and theological justification. Those smooth stone blocks didn't move themselves. Those vast plantations didn't self-harvest. The mighty Egyptian war machine wasn't just conquering territory, it was capturing the human engines that would power Egypt's next construction project, next harvest, next generation of unfree labor. Every war became a human mining operation, with foreign populations extracted like resources and refined into property. The terrified captive's first glimpse of Egypt's splendor came with a horrifying realization. All this magnificence existed because countless others had walked this same path of tears before them. Their labor transformed into monuments, their lives consumed by an empire that saw people not as individuals, but as assets to be acquired through the point of a spear. Children were ancient Egypt's most disturbing commodity, highly valued, easily molded, and completely defenseless. While adults might resist their new reality, children became clay in Egyptian hands. Their identities erased more thoroughly than hieroglyphics during a political coup. In the markets of Memphis and Thebes, child prices often exceeded those of adults. But this wasn't because Egyptians were particularly fond of children. Therefore, it was simple economics. They offered better return on investment. A 10-year-old Nubian boy might serve for 30 years or more, while an adult might have only 15 productive years left. Children were literally depreciating assets with excellent longevity potential. You're 6 years old when they separate you from your mother. The Egyptian official doesn't see your tears as a human response. He sees them as temporary product damage that will self-repair. Your small hands will soon serve Egyptian masters. Your young mind will forget your birth language. Your soft heart will harden just enough to survive, but not enough to resist. Your entire existence has been reduced to potential usefulness. Archaeological evidence from servant quarters in elite Egyptian households reveals separate sleeping areas for child servants, often crowded with 10 or more children in spaces barely suitable for 3 adults. Children as young as 5 worked in Egyptian households, and their skeletal remains tell stories their silenced voices cannot. Stunted growth, repetitive stress injuries, and malnutrition were common. Historians still argue whether foreign children in Egyptian households experienced a form of cultural adoption, or if the relationship remained purely exploitative despite superficial integration into family structures. The training begins immediately. Forget your name, forget your gods, forget your family's stories. You're given an Egyptian name, usually something functional like little helper or house child. Not quite as bad as naming your dog Dog, but on the same dehumanizing spectrum. Egyptian language lessons aren't optional. Mispronunciations earn swift corrections, sometimes with a cane across your knuckles. Within a year, your mother tongue starts to fade. Within 3, you dream in Egyptian. Your past becomes like a half-remembered bedtime story, something that happened to someone else. Did you know some wealthy Egyptians collected foreign children like modern billionaires collect sports teams? One tomb painting from the 18th dynasty shows a nobleman proudly displaying 12 foreign children of different ethnicities, dressed in Egyptian clothes, but with their native hairstyles preserved, the ancient equivalent of keeping the packaging on your limited edition collectibles. The children are labeled by origin: Nubian, Syrian, Libyan, Hittite, a living gallery of Egypt's imperial reach. Child servants were assigned tasks based on their size and abilities. The smallest cleaned hard-to-reach places, fetched water, and ran messages. Those with dexterity might be trained in hairdressing or cosmetic application. Strong ones carried loads or helped in kitchens. Pretty ones were positioned where guests could see them, living decorations that enhanced a household's prestige. It's like having a specialized app for each household function, except each app was a traumatized child far from home. The particularly cruel irony: Egyptian families deeply loved their own children. Tomb paintings show Egyptian parents embracing their children, playing games with them, educating them. These same paintings might casually include foreign child servants standing nearby, carrying fans or offerings, their humanity reduced to background decoration. The cognitive dissonance is remarkable, like posting about animal rights while eating a burger, but with actual human beings as the disconnect. Royal households maintained special training facilities for foreign children. These weren't schools so much as programming centers. Children learned strict protocols for serving food without looking at diners, for entering rooms without making noise, for standing perfectly still for hours. Imagine the world's most demanding boarding school, where graduation means a lifetime of servitude, and the punishment for failing exams involves things that would get this video demonetized. The most fortunate foreign children were those selected for palace service. Their training was rigorous, but their living conditions better. They ate food rejected from royal tables, still better than what field workers received. They slept in designated quarters rather than on kitchen floors. Their clothing was clean and sometimes fine. But make no mistake, their lives weren't their own. Even these privileged children were property, their movements restricted, their futures predetermined, their bodies subject to whatever use their owners decreed. For girls, puberty brought new dangers and valuations. Once they could bear children, their worth shifted. Some were married to other servants to produce new generations of workers born into bondage, a self-replicating workforce requiring no additional conquest. Others became concubines or were gifted to visitors. The prettiest might find themselves in harems or as attendants to noble women. Their reproductive capacity became a commodity feature rather than a personal aspect of their humanity, like upgrading your phone to a model with better battery life, except the battery is a young woman's womb. Boys approaching manhood faced different challenges. The strongest went to labor camps, fields, or mines. The most intelligent might become scribal assistants or low-level administrators. Those deemed attractive might serve in temples or palaces. The truly unfortunate were those sent to mines or quarries, where survival beyond a few years was unlikely. At least Amazon warehouse workers get bathroom breaks and don't have to chisel through granite with copper tools. Perhaps most disturbing was how thoroughly these children were conditioned to accept their status. Egyptian wisdom literature contained instructions for managing servants that emphasized starting their training young. The foreign child's back is made to listen. When he is beaten, he understands. Children who arrived at age 5 or 6 might have no memory of freedom by adulthood. They became not just physically, but psychologically enslaved, unable to conceive of existence outside their prescribed role. It's gaslighting on a civilizational scale. Some children developed specialized skills that provided limited protection. A child who excelled at music might receive better treatment. One who showed aptitude for a craft might be apprenticed rather than assigned to manual labor. But these opportunities weren't choices. They were owner decisions about how to maximize return on human property. Your talents weren't yours to develop. They were features for others to exploit. Like discovering your kid is good at math and immediately planning how this will benefit your retirement account rather than their future. Within this system emerged complex hierarchies even among child servants. Those born to servants already in Egyptian households, second generation unfree, often received better treatment than newly captured children. They spoke perfect Egyptian, understood cultural norms, and had no memories of freedom to cause resistance. They sometimes became enforcers, training newer arrivals with particular harshness. Trauma doesn't just replicate, it cascades, creating collaborators from victims. Foreign royal children occupied a strange middle ground. Taken as hostages during peace treaties or after conquests, they received education alongside Egyptian elites. They wore fine clothes, ate good food, and learned writing and military arts. But this wasn't generosity. It was strategic. After years of indoctrination, they would be installed as puppet rulers in their homelands, ensuring those territories remained loyal to Egypt. It's like a particularly sinister foreign exchange program where the students return as corporate spies. The physical toll on these children was severe. Skeletal remains from servant quarters show widespread malnutrition, bone deformities from carrying heavy loads, and injuries that healed without treatment. Their growth was stunted, their bodies worn before adulthood. Most shocking are the deaths. Child servants rarely lived beyond 30, their bodies discarded with minimal ceremony, sometimes in mass graves outside worker villages. They were used up and thrown away, the physical evidence of their lives as disposable as their humanity was in Egyptian eyes. What makes this system particularly heartbreaking is how it weaponized childhood's natural adaptability. Children aren't just physically vulnerable, they're psychologically malleable. They seek approval, crave stability, and adapt to survive. The Egyptians didn't just exploit children's bodies. They colonized their minds, replacing their identities with constructed ones serving Egyptian needs. These children didn't just lose their freedom, they lost themselves in ways adult captives could resist. By the time you reach adulthood in an Egyptian household, your memories of before have faded to shadows. Your first language sounds foreign to your ears. Your birth name feels like it belonged to someone else. You might dream occasionally of faces you can no longer name, places you can't quite remember. But your waking reality is absolute. You are property, not person. Your existence is defined by service. And when you see new children arrive, eyes wide with fear and confusion, you feel a strange blend of pity and detachment. After all, they'll adapt too. They'll forget too. They'll become like you, a perfect product of Egypt's most efficient and devastating industry, the systematic transformation of free children into compliant tools. Your body isn't your own anymore. The moment you become someone else's property in ancient Egypt, your flesh becomes a canvas for their ownership, their preferences, their stamp of possession. Bodies of the unfree weren't just controlled, they were physically rewritten. But this wasn't random cruelty. Therefore, it was deliberate transformation with economic purpose. Egyptian slave owners didn't just want your labor, they wanted visible proof of their ownership branded into your very skin. Marking the body separated the free from the unfree with devastating clarity. A tattoo along your forehead, a brand on your shoulder, distinctive scarification that announced your status from 50 paces. These weren't fashion choices. They were permanent ID badges you could never remove, never hide, never escape. In a society where writing was sacred, what more powerful statement than writing ownership directly onto human flesh? It's like getting an employment contract tattooed on your face, except you didn't sign it and can never quit. Archaeological evidence from Deir el Medina shows that temple slaves often received distinctive markings or brands identifying them as property of specific deities. Mummies discovered with unusual tattoo patterns on shoulders and backs were likely unfree persons, their status literally inscribed onto their bodies even into the afterlife. Historians still argue whether these markings served primarily as ownership indicators, or if they also had religious significance, perhaps dedicating the marked individual to the deity they served. The practical modifications began with hair. Egyptian standards required specific hairstyles for different categories of servants. Newly captured foreigners had their cultural hairstyles immediately shorn. A Nubian's distinctive locks, Assyrians' carefully oiled curls, a Libyan's side braid, all replaced with standardized styles marking their new status. Hair wasn't just about looks, it was identity. Cutting it was step one in erasing who you used to be. Modern corporate dress codes seem downright libertarian by comparison. At least your manager doesn't physically hold you down and shave distinctive patterns into your scalp on your first day. For household slaves, especially those serving elite families, physical presentation became a bizarre form of living interior decoration. Your appearance needed to complement your owner's aesthetic sensibilities. Skin was scrubbed, oiled, sometimes even tinted. Teeth were inspected, with obvious problems addressed not for your comfort, but to improve your appearance. Think of it as extreme makeover, ancient edition, where the participant has no choice and the audience is one wealthy Egyptian family judging your every move. Body modifications weren't limited to surface treatments. Deliberate scarification, raised patterns of scars created through cutting and irritating the wounds, marked some unfree people, particularly those from Nubian territories. These weren't random. They followed specific patterns marking both status and origin. Some wealthier households had their family emblem scarified onto their servants' bodies, the ancient equivalent of corporate branding taken to disturbingly literal extremes. One of the most distinctive and disturbing practices was the tattooing of female captives. Using indigo-colored ink and bone needles, Egyptian masters marked women with dot patterns, geometric designs, or even divine symbols. These weren't decorative but functional. They identified ownership, indicated status, and sometimes marked reproductive capacity. Women intended for temple service received specific patterns associated with deities. Those designated for household service had different markings. It was basically a horrific human filing system inked directly into flesh, like barcodes, but with more infection risk and zero anesthetic. Did you know that some particularly valuable captives had their ears pierced with distinctive gold rings that couldn't be removed without damaging the ear? These weren't fashion accessories, but ownership markers that made escape more difficult. One tomb painting from the 18th dynasty shows a Syrian captive with 5 such rings, each bearing the cartouche of his Egyptian owner. The ancient equivalent of those anti-theft devices stores attached to expensive clothing, except permanently attached to a human being. For male captives in certain roles, castration represented the most extreme form of body modification. Eunuchs served in specific capacities where their modified status was considered advantageous, guarding female quarters, serving in certain temple roles, or managing household affairs where reproductive capacity was deemed undesirable. This wasn't universal practice, but targeted towards specific service categories. While we associate eunuchs more commonly with later empires like Persia or Rome, Egyptian texts reference men who are not men in royal household inventories. The ancient world's most extreme job requirement, with zero healthcare coverage and definitely no workers' compensation. The physical modifications extended to dress and adornment, not choices but requirements. Household slaves wore specific garments marking their status, often minimal and standardized. Some wore metal collars or wristbands with their owner's name or symbol. Temple slaves had distinctive garments identifying which deity they served. Military captives working in mines or fields wore almost nothing, their bodies exposed to the elements as another form of control. Your clothing wasn't protection or expression, but another layer of ownership. another visual reminder of who controlled your existence. For captives with specialized roles, the modifications could be more elaborate. Those serving as entertainment, musicians, dancers, acrobats, might receive extensive cosmetic treatments to enhance their appearance. Dancers had their bodies oiled and adorned. Musicians were dressed to complement their instruments. Some performers were even painted with gold dust for special occasions. Their bodies became literally objectified, not just treated as objects, but decorated like them, transformed into living art pieces for their owners' pleasure. The ultimate body modification was the application of owners' marks, names or symbols physically branded or tattooed onto skin. These weren't subtle. They were large, visible, unmistakable declarations of ownership. A temple brand might cover half your forearm. A royal mark could span your entire shoulder blade. A noble household symbol might stretch across your cheek. These weren't just identification. They were psychological tools breaking down resistance and individuality. How can you maintain your sense of self when someone else's name is literally burned into your skin? The bodies of the unfree also underwent involuntary transformation through labor. Skeletal remains tell stories of bodies bent and broken by impossible tasks. Spines curved from carrying stones, joints eroded from grinding grain, bones broken and badly healed, teeth worn down from using them as tools. These weren't intentional modifications, but the inevitable result of treating human bodies as machines with disposable parts. The average Egyptian field slave showed the physical effects of a lifetime of labor by age 25, roughly the same age when a modern corporate employee realizes their ergonomic chair isn't actually preventing back problems. The most insidious aspect of these physical transformations was how they created visual hierarchies, reinforcing the system. The unmarked, unmarred body became the exclusive privilege of the free Egyptian. The marked, modified body immediately identified the unfree, allowing for instant social sorting. Your physical appearance announced your status before you spoke a word, before you took a single action. Your body betrayed you, collaborated with your oppressors, carried their message on your very skin. For children born into captivity, these transformations often began early. Temple records mention children as young as 6 receiving tattoos, indicating their dedicated status. Children born to house slaves might receive owner's marks shortly after birth. Their bodies never belonged to them, not even for a moment. They grew up seeing their status written on their skin, internalizing that message before they could question it. Some captives attempted to modify or remove these marks, desperate efforts at reclaiming their bodies and identities. Scarification could sometimes be reopened and altered. Tattoos might be cut out, leaving scars that were less obviously ownership marks. Brands could be burned again, obscuring the original pattern. But these attempts carried serious risks: infection, permanent disfigurement, and severe punishment if discovered. Most chose to live with their marks rather than risk worse consequences. A rational calculation when the alternative might be death. What made this system so perversely effective was how it weaponized visibility. In most modern human trafficking, perpetrators try to hide their victims. In ancient Egypt, they proudly displayed them, their status and ownership literally written on their bodies for all to see. The marked body wasn't hidden away, but paraded as a symbol of wealth, power, and divine favor. The entire system operated in plain sight, the evidence walking through streets, serving in temples, laboring in fields. Human billboards advertising their own subjugation. Your tattoos fade slightly over decades. Your brands scar and become less distinct. Your hair grows differently as you age. But nothing erases these marks completely. Even in death, your modified body tells archaeologists who you were, or rather, who you were forced to become. Your skeleton bears the marks of whose property you were, what labor you performed, how little your suffering mattered. In ancient Egypt, the final indignity wasn't just having your body owned in life, it was having that ownership permanently inscribed into your very flesh. a message that would outlast not just your freedom, but your heartbeat. The pharaoh's palace wasn't just the seat of power, it was history's most extravagant human warehouse. Behind those gleaming limestone walls and beneath those painted ceilings lived thousands of people who weren't guests or officials, but property. Royal appetites for human ownership dwarfed those of nobles or temples. But this wasn't just a matter of status or luxury. Therefore, it was practical necessity. Running an ancient empire required an army of hands, each assigned to increasingly specialized tasks. From the highest royal wife to the lowest kitchen scrubber, the palace operated as a meticulous ecosystem of human ownership, where your value was determined by your usefulness to the crown. You're standing in the reception hall of Amenhotep III's palace at Malkata. The space stretches impossibly wide, columns rising like stone trees, walls alive with painted scenes of royal triumph. But what strikes you most isn't the architecture, it's the people. Hundreds of them, moving with practiced precision, creating an elaborate human machine. The bald, white-robed priest carrying incense, the Nubian fan-bearers creating artificial breezes, the Syrian musicians playing softly in the corner, the cleaners constantly polishing floors, the food tasters checking each morsel before it reaches royal lips. Each person represents a distinct acquisition, a human asset obtained through war, tribute, purchase, or birth into palace bondage. Archaeological excavations at royal sites reveal servant quarters capable of housing several thousand unfree individuals. At the palace of Ramesses X, at Pi Ramesses, specialized barracks housed servants by category: food preparers, launders, cleaners, artisans, with distinct areas for those of different ethnic origins. Historians still argue whether these ethnic groupings were maintained to preserve specialized cultural skills or simply to prevent solidarity among diverse, unfree populations that might otherwise find common cause against their Egyptian masters. The royal household operated on an industrial scale of human consumption. Pharaonic inscriptions boast of thousands of captives added to palace holdings after successful military campaigns. One particularly disturbing inventory tablet from Amenhotep II's reign categorizes new palace acquisitions with the same bureaucratic precision you'd expect from an Amazon warehouse manager tracking holiday stock. 471 Syrians, 228 male, 243 female, 101 Nubians, specialty trained for household service, 65 Libyans, for garden work. Imagine your corporate HR department issuing quarterly reports on how many humans they'd successfully stockpiled, complete with pie charts breaking down ethnicities and skill sets. Palace acquisition wasn't random. It followed careful protocols designed to maintain quality control. Military captives intended for royal service underwent extensive screening. Only the most physically perfect specimens would serve in visible roles. Those with specialized skills, musicians, artisans, cooks, underwent competency testing. Palace agents visited markets specifically seeking individuals with desirable traits. It was essentially ancient executive headhunting, except the recruited talent didn't get stock options or dental benefits, just the dubious privilege of proximity to power. Did you know that some palace servants were deliberately selected as matching sets? Royal aesthetic preferences sometimes demanded uniformity among visible servants. Documentation from Hatshepsut's palace mentions 12 Nubian youths of identical height, acquired specifically to carry the royal litter. Another record describes twin Asiatic girls with unusual eye color purchased at great expense to serve as identical attendants for a royal daughter. The palace collected humans like designer furniture pieces, selected for how well they complemented the royal decor rather than for their humanity. The hierarchy within palace slavery was Byzantine in its complexity. At the top were the personal body servants to the pharaoh and royal family, positions of relative privilege that occasionally allowed for actual influence. Below them came specialized service providers, musicians, chefs, massage therapists, hairdressers. Then the skilled craftspeople maintaining palace luxury, weavers, jewelers, furniture makers. Further down were general household servants, cleaners, launders, food preparers, At the bottom existed those assigned to hard labor, water carriers, construction workers, garden laborers. Your position in this hierarchy determined everything: what you ate, where you slept, how you were treated, whether you were even seen as partially human or merely as animated equipment. Royal ownership came with perverse status distinctions. Being owned by the pharaoh rather than a temple or private citizen carried certain advantages: better food, better housing, potentially better treatment. Some palace servants wore special insignia or garments, marking them as royal property, which protected them when moving through the city on palace business. It was the ancient equivalent of having a premium brand name stamped on your otherwise identical product, a Gucci paperclip versus a regular one, except the paperclip is a human being with hopes, dreams, and a family they'll never see again. The palace particularly valued exotic foreigners. Nubians served as guards and performers. Syrians and Canaanites with pale skin and light eyes became personal attendants to royal women. Libyans worked with horses and chariots. People weren't just valued for skills, but for their visual distinctiveness, living status symbols demonstrating the pharaoh's reach across the known world. The more remote your homeland, the more unusual your appearance, the more valuable you might be as a palace curiosity. Imagine being valued primarily because you look different enough to be an interesting conversation piece at royal dinner parties. The training regimen for palace servants was brutally comprehensive. Every movement had prescribed forms. Every interaction followed strict protocols. Even breathing patterns were regulated. Servants weren't to be heard respirating in royal presence. Those serving food underwent months of training to move silently, maintain perfect posture, and keep their eyes properly downcast. The palace didn't want servants. It wanted perfect human machines, performing their functions with mechanical precision. Modern corporate training seminars, with their trust falls and personality assessments, suddenly seemed downright humane by comparison. Children born to palace servants inherited their parents' unfree status, but underwent standardized training from early ages. Palace schools trained servant children in specialized roles, often different from their parents. The most attractive or intelligent might be selected for higher status positions. This created a strange merit-based advancement system within an inherently unfree context, like being promoted to a nicer cell in the same prison, complete with performance reviews delivered at the end of a switch. For all its luxury, the palace remained a gilded cage for its human property. Quarters were crowded, privacy non-existent. Every aspect of life, eating, sleeping, bathing, happened under supervision. Romantic relationships required permission. Children could be reassigned at any time. The psychological weight of constant surveillance shaped behavior until palace servants internalized their conditioning, becoming their own jailers. Their bodies might reside in the center of Egyptian power and splendor, but their minds remained as tightly controlled as those laboring in distant quarries. Palace ownership wasn't static, but shifted with political winds. When a pharaoh died, their personal servants might be reassigned, given to temples, or even sacrificed to accompany their master, though this practice became largely symbolic rather than literal in later periods. A new pharaoh meant new preferences, new hierarchies, new favored servants. Your status could change overnight based on royal whim, or simply because your appearance no longer matched current aesthetic preferences. It was like being an app that suddenly isn't compatible with the newest operating system, instantly obsolete, despite functioning perfectly well yesterday. The most disturbing aspect of palace slavery was its permanence. While temple slaves might eventually be released and private slaves occasionally manumitted, palace servants rarely escaped their status. The royal household was a lifetime appointment, your service ending only with death. Even then, your remains might not be yours. Some high-status servants were mummified to continue serving royalty in the afterlife. The palace didn't just own your labor or your body, it claimed your entire existence across multiple planes of reality. What archaeologists find particularly challenging is separating the voluntary from the involuntary in palace service. Egyptian art shows all servants smiling, well-dressed, seemingly content. Records list generous rations and specialized housing. But these same records reveal strict punishments for attempted escape, physical markings denoting ownership, and the complete absence of personal agency. The visual propaganda of happy service masks the fundamental reality. No matter how well fed the cage or how gilded the chains, ownership remains ownership. The pharaoh's palace stands in our imagination as the pinnacle of ancient splendor, a place of gold, alabaster, and divine kingship. We marvel at its painted halls, its sprawling gardens, its architectural achievements. But strip away the limestone and the luxury, and what remains is a massive machine built on human ownership, a system that consumed thousands of lives to support the comfort and status of a divine few. Every polished floor tile, every perfectly prepared meal, every wafting fan creating cool air in desert heat came at the cost of someone's freedom, someone's family, someone's future. A monument not just to royal power, but to humanity's endless capacity to normalize the ownership of other humans, so long as the results are sufficiently impressive. Royal marriage in ancient Egypt was rarely about love. It was human trafficking, disguised as diplomacy. Foreign princesses arrived in Egypt not as eager brides, but as living treaties, human collateral, ensuring peace between kingdoms. Their journeys began with ceremony, but ended in captivity. These women traveled thousands of miles, accompanied by treasure, servants, and guards. But upon crossing the Egyptian border, the escorts would return home. Therefore, the princess remained alone, surrounded by strangers speaking an unfamiliar language. The gold and gifts she brought weren't her dowry. They were the purchase price her father's kingdom paid to secure Egyptian cooperation. You're a 16-year-old Hittite princess, daughter of a king who's fought Egypt to a stalemate. The peace treaty includes you as a key provision, bundled between clauses about border security and trade agreements. Your father embraces you one last time, whispering that you're saving thousands of lives. Your mother gives you a small amulet to hide beneath your clothes, a piece of home to carry into exile. You've been trained for this moment since childhood, but nothing prepares you for the reality of becoming a living diplomatic instrument. Inscriptions from Ramesses II's reign document his marriage to a Hittite princess following the famous Battle of Kadesh, describing her arrival with gold, silver, bronze, slaves, and precious stones beyond counting. She arrived with an entourage of 317 people, but would never see her homeland again. Historians still argue whether these foreign royal women maintained communication with their birth families, or if their diplomatic value required complete severance of previous loyalties. The official welcome is spectacular. Crowds line the streets, musicians play, incense fills the air. You're paraded through Memphis or Thebes like a trophy, which is essentially what you are. Proof of Egyptian dominance, not through conquest, but through alliance. The Egyptians rename you immediately, giving you an Egyptian name honoring their goddess Hathor or Isis. Your identity begins its systematic erasure. It's like international adoption, corporate merger, and human trafficking all rolled into one geopolitical package without the benefit of child protective services or human rights observers. Upon reaching the palace, your real position becomes clear. You won't be Pharaoh's only wife. You might be his 3rd, 7th, or 20th, joining a complex harem hierarchy where Egyptian-born royal women occupy the highest positions. You're valuable, but foreign, important, but never quite equal. Your children, should you have them, will likely never rule unless every Egyptian-born heir conveniently disappears. Think of it as joining a company as a highly touted outside hire, only to discover you'll never make executive leadership because you didn't graduate from the right kindergarten. The pharaonic harem wasn't the silk-draped fantasy of later Orientalist imagination. It was a strictly regulated institution with economic, political, and religious functions. Foreign wives lived in dedicated quarters, sometimes in entirely separate palace complexes, like the one archaeologists uncovered at Gurob. These weren't pleasure palaces, but administrative centers where foreign women supervised workshops, managed estates, and conducted diplomatic correspondence. The work might be high status, but the golden cage remained a cage nonetheless. Did you know that some foreign royal wives maintained miniature versions of their homeland's religious practices within their Egyptian quarters? One peculiar archaeological find from Amenhotep III's palace includes a small Mitannian shrine hidden behind a wall panel in a foreign wife's chamber. Apparently, she secretly maintained her ancestral worship while publicly participating in Egyptian religious ceremonies, the ancient equivalent of keeping your old religion in the browser's incognito mode while your Egyptian husband checks your history. The psychological journey of these women followed predictable stages. First came isolation, separated from familiar people, language, and customs. Then re-education, intensive instruction in Egyptian language, religion, and etiquette. Finally came transformation, the gradual conversion of foreign princess into Egyptian royal wife. Some resisted, maintaining their identity through small private rituals. Others surrendered completely, becoming more Egyptian than the Egyptians in desperate attempts to secure position for themselves and any children they might bear. It was Stockholm Syndrome on a diplomatic scale. The physical transformation was equally comprehensive. Your Hittite, Mitannian, or Babylonian clothing is replaced with Egyptian linen. Your hairstyle is changed to match Egyptian fashion. Your body is adorned with Egyptian jewelry, your face painted with Egyptian cosmetics. Only your foreign features remain as evidence of your origin, and even those might be downplayed in official representations. In royal art, you might be depicted with the same conventionally Egyptian appearance as native-born wives, your foreignness politely erased from the visual record. It's ancient Egypt's version of an Instagram filter that automatically edits out any trace of your authentic self. Your value in the harem hierarchy depends on several factors. The power of your father's kingdom matters. A Hittite princess outranks a Libyan one. Your personal attributes count. Beauty, intelligence, charm can elevate your position. But most crucial is Pharaoh's favor, that mercurial currency that might shine on you one month and abandon you the next. The competition is relentless, with dozens of women vying for limited royal attention. Imagine The Bachelor, but with geopolitical consequences and absolutely no option to reject the final rose. For foreign royal wives who bore children, life became increasingly complex. Their offspring occupied an ambiguous position, royal Egyptian blood mixed with foreign ancestry. Some pharaohs elevated these half-foreign children, perhaps seeing diplomatic advantage in their mixed heritage. Others marginalized them, fearing foreign influence in the royal bloodline. As a foreign-born mother, your entire existence became focused on advancing your children's position, fighting against the subtle and not-so-subtle discrimination they faced within palace walls. The isolation of these women was profound. They might spend decades in Egypt without ever speaking their native language to another person. Their servants were Egyptian, their attendants were Egyptian, their religious advisors were Egyptian. Every aspect of their environment reinforced their status as the foreign element that must adapt or perish. Some foreign wives found companionship with other foreign-born women in similar situations, creating micro-communities within the larger harem structure. Others remained profoundly alone, despite being surrounded by hundreds of people daily. The Egyptian historical record presents these marriages as honors bestowed upon foreign kingdoms, the magnanimous pharaoh accepting a foreign princess into his divine presence. But the power dynamic was unmistakable. Egypt received hostages, ensuring good behavior from potential enemies. Foreign kings received Egyptian promises of peace, but no reciprocal royal Egyptian women. The traffic in royal women flowed one way, toward Egypt, never away from it. Even the mightiest foreign powers had to pay this human tribute to secure Egyptian cooperation. Occasionally, a particularly shrewd or fortunate foreign wife managed to accumulate actual influence. The Mitannian princess Gilukhepa, married to Amenhotep III, eventually controlled significant economic resources and maintained her own diplomatic correspondence. A Hittite wife of Ramesses II, renamed Mathor-neferura, became a ceremonial participant in Egyptian religious rituals, an unusual honor for a foreign-born woman. These exceptions proved the rule. Power was possible but never guaranteed, always conditional on Egyptian terms. The children of these unions faced their own challenges. Half Egyptian, half foreign, they belonged fully to neither world, Egyptian enough to be royal, but foreign enough to be suspect. Their mothers pushed them toward Egyptian identity, knowing it was their only path to acceptance. These children became living embodiments of Egypt's diplomatic entanglements, their very existence a reminder of political calculations made before their birth. Some embraced their hybrid status, becoming bridges between cultures. Others rejected their foreign heritage entirely, becoming more aggressively Egyptian than their full-blooded counterparts. What happened to aging foreign wives when their diplomatic value waned, when their birth father died and a new king ruled their homeland? When a new pharaoh took the throne with different diplomatic priorities? The record grows silent. Some likely retired to obscure estate households. Others may have found roles mentoring newer foreign arrivals. The lucky ones maintained connections to their adult children with positions at court. The unlucky simply disappeared from history, having served their purpose as living treaty clauses. Most poignant are the rare archaeological traces of these women's authentic selves. A small clay figurine of a non-Egyptian deity hidden in a personal chest. A letter written in their native language concealed within a cosmetic box. A piece of jewelry in their homeland style worn beneath Egyptian garments. Tiny acts of resistance, small assertions of an identity that official Egypt worked systematically to erase. These weren't just foreign wives adapting to a new culture. They were women fighting to remember who they were in a system designed to remake them entirely. The diplomatic marriage system operated for over 1,000 years, consuming generations of royal women from kingdoms throughout the Near East and Nubia. Each arrival followed the same pattern: ceremonial welcome, cultural reprogramming, absorption into the harem system. Their stories blur together in Egyptian records, one foreign princess indistinguishable from another except for the kingdom she represented. Their individual hopes, fears, and experiences vanish beneath the weight of geopolitical machinery that process them like resources rather than people. What makes these royal trafficking victims particularly tragic is the veneer of honor covering their captivity. They weren't taken in raids or purchased in markets, but arrived with ceremony, officially respected as royal women. Their prisons had golden walls. Their servitude was called marriage. Their isolation was termed elevation. The system disguised exploitation as alliance, wrapping human trafficking in diplomatic protocol and religious ceremony until the women themselves might forget they hadn't chosen this path. After all, the most effective cage isn't the one you can see. It's the one you've been convinced is actually a palace built especially for you. Egypt didn't just want Nubian gold, it wanted Nubians. The kingdom's relationship with its southern neighbor wasn't simply imperial, it was extractive on a human scale. Nubians were targeted with unique intensity among Egypt's many conquered peoples. But this wasn't random prejudice. Therefore, it was calculated economic strategy. Nubian bodies were particularly valuable assets in Egypt's human trafficking portfolio. Strong, skilled in mining, and familiar with gold extraction, Nubians became living tools in Egypt's quest for precious metals. Egypt saw Nubia as a 2-for-1 resource opportunity. Take the gold from the ground, then take the people who knew how to find it. You're walking through an Egyptian gold mine in Nubia's eastern desert. The heat is suffocating. The air tastes of dust and despair. Around you, hundreds of Nubian workers chip at stone walls with copper tools, their bodies gaunt from malnutrition, their skin scarred from punishment. Egyptian overseers watch from elevated positions, water jugs at their sides. The workers receive water only 3 times daily, just enough to keep them alive, not enough to ease their thirst. Survival here isn't measured in years, but in months. These aren't workers, they're consumables. Archaeological evidence from mine sites in Wadi al-Aki and Wadi Gabgaba reveals the staggering scale of forced Nubian labor. Remains of massive barracks show some mining operations housed over 1,000 workers in facilities designed for control rather than comfort. Historians still argue whether the extremely high mortality rate at these mines was an unfortunate consequence of harsh conditions or a deliberate calculation, with Egyptian administrators potentially viewing Nubian miners as expendable resources not worth the cost of better maintenance. The systematic targeting of Nubians began early. Egypt's Middle Kingdom texts already discuss specialized raids into Nubian territories specifically to capture workers. By the New Kingdom, this had evolved into a sophisticated acquisition system. Dedicated military expeditions would target Nubian villages during dry seasons, when communities gathered near remaining water sources. The tactics weren't just brutal, they were efficient. The Egyptian army didn't want to kill Nubians. Dead bodies yielded no labor. They wanted intact human merchandise. It's like if Amazon designed a military strategy: maximum capture efficiency with minimal product damage. What made Nubians particularly valuable was their knowledge. They understood gold, where to find it, how to extract it, how to process it. Egypt could have just hired Nubian expertise, establishing mutually beneficial trade relationships. Instead, they chose to acquire the knowledge by acquiring the people who possessed it. Imagine if instead of paying software engineers, tech companies just kidnapped them and forced them to code under threat of beating. Actually, given current working conditions in some tech companies, perhaps that's not the most far-fetched comparison. Once captured, Nubians faced a brutal sorting process. The strongest and healthiest men went to mines. Skilled craftspeople were sent to workshops. Women with children often worked in agricultural settings. Young, attractive women might be sent to households or temples. The elderly were frequently abandoned or killed as unprofitable investments. This wasn't random cruelty. It was asset allocation. Human beings categorized by potential return on investment. It's like a particularly twisted version of corporate team-building exercises, where the team gets permanently separated and worked to death. The conditions in Nubian gold mines represent ancient Egypt's darkest labor practices. Workers chipped at rock faces in narrow tunnels, breathing dust that gradually destroyed their lungs. Summer temperatures in these desert mines regularly exceeded 120 degrees. Water was strictly rationed. Food was minimal, just enough to maintain necessary strength. Breaks were few. Punishment for not meeting quotas was severe. The average life expectancy of a Nubian mine worker, perhaps 2 to 3 years after arrival. Workplace safety standards made modern sweatshops look like Google headquarters by comparison. Did you know that archaeologists found one particularly disturbing site, where Nubian miners were apparently housed in abandoned mining tunnels themselves? At Bir Fawahir, evidence suggests workers actually lived in the same narrow, airless passages they worked in, never seeing daylight except during brief water breaks. Imagine your office cubicle also being your bedroom, bathroom, and eventual tomb, the ultimate in efficient spatial utilization from a management perspective. The Egyptian economic records tell the story through cold numbers. One papyrus from Ramesses III's reign mentions acquiring 1,100 Nubians for the southern mines in a single expedition, then casually notes a need to acquire 800 replacements within 8 months for the same operation. The mathematics of human exploitation laid bare. A projected 66% mortality rate treated as a standard operating expense. The same document discusses acquiring livestock with far more concern for their welfare and longevity. Cattle received better treatment than people. They had better resale value. For Nubian women and children, the situation was marginally better, only because their economic value lasted longer in different settings. Women often worked in textile production, food processing, or agricultural labor. Children were seen as investments, trainable for specialized roles once they survived to useful age. Many Nubian children were systematically separated from their parents and raised in what might be called training compounds, where they learned Egyptian language and skills while forgetting their Nubian heritage. It's like a horrifying boarding school where the graduation ceremony involves permanent servitude and cultural amnesia. What makes the Egyptian-Nubian human trafficking relationship particularly insidious was its duration. This wasn't a brief historical episode, but a systematic practice spanning over 1,000 years. Generation after generation of Nubians lived and died in Egyptian mines, workshops, and fields. Egyptian art and texts reveal an unsettling pattern. Early depictions show Nubians as foreign enemies. Later ones show them as natural servants, as if their subordinate status had become an accepted cosmic truth rather than the result of generations of imperial violence. It's the ultimate example of rewriting history, convincing both the oppressor and the oppressed that their relationship is natural and inevitable. The cultural appropriation ran alongside human appropriation. Egypt didn't just take Nubian bodies, it took Nubian knowledge, Nubian gold-working techniques, Nubian artistic motifs, and Nubian religious elements. These were incorporated into Egyptian culture without acknowledgement, while actual Nubians remained categorized as inherently inferior. Imagine stealing someone's family recipes, publishing a best-selling cookbook, and then hiring them as your kitchen servant without credit or compensation. Now multiply that injustice by an entire civilization. Despite overwhelming oppression, Nubian resistance persisted. Evidence of sabotage appears in mining records. Tools damaged, production slowed, occasional escape attempts. Some regions of Nubia remained fiercely independent, launching raids to free captured kin. Within Egypt, communities of Nubians maintained cultural practices in secret, preserving language and traditions despite generations of forced assimilation. Egyptian texts mention periodic disturbances requiring military response, bureaucratic language masking uprisings by people fighting for basic human dignity. The economic impact of Nubian forced labor on Egyptian wealth was incalculable. The gold mines of Nubia provided much of the precious metal that made Egypt legendary for its splendor. Each golden statue, each gilded tomb item, each piece of royal jewelry contained not just gold, but the uncredited labor and shortened lives of those who extracted it. The gleaming treasures in museum displays represent not just artistic achievement but human cost, each ounce of gold purchased with human suffering. That King Tut mask that looks so impressive on postcards. Think of it as a solid gold monument to generational trauma. What happened to Nubians too injured or old to work? Egyptian records grow conspicuously silent. Some evidence suggests limited care facilities existed near major mining operations, not from compassion, but to extract final labor from damaged human property. Others were simply abandoned when no longer profitable. A few may have been returned to settlements as examples of the consequences of resistance. The vast majority simply disappear from historical record, their bodies likely left in the same desert that consumed their lives. By the late New Kingdom, the exploitation had grown so efficient it became institutionalized in Egyptian administration. Special offices managed the Nubian resource with dedicated officials, supply chains, and replacement schedules. The bureaucracy of human trafficking developed its own momentum, continuing across changes in dynasty and political leadership. The system wasn't tied to any particular pharaoh's policy, but had become a fundamental part of how Egypt understood its relationship with Nubia, a relationship where one people existed primarily as a resource for the other's benefit. Some Nubians eventually occupied specialized roles in Egyptian society: soldiers, mercenaries, household servants, even occasional officials. But these exceptions obscure the fundamental reality that most lived and died as disposable labor. Their individual stories, hopes, resistance, and suffering vanish beneath the Egyptian narrative of imperial glory and divine right. We know the names of Egyptian mine administrators, but not a single name of the thousands of Nubians who died extracting wealth for their oppressors. The true tragedy of Egypt's Nubian gold policy wasn't just the physical suffering it caused, but the generations of potential it destroyed. Each person worked to death in those mines represented an entire future erased. Children never born, traditions never passed down, innovations never realized, joy never experienced. Nubia eventually regained independence and even conquered Egypt during the Kushite period. But the generations lost to Egyptian mines could never be recovered. When museum placards dispassionately note that an artifact is made of Nubian gold, they omit the human story behind that material. They don't mention the villages raided, the families separated, the bodies broken in narrow tunnels beneath the eastern desert. They don't acknowledge that each gleaming treasure was purchased not just with wealth, but with blood. The true price of Egyptian splendor wasn't measured in precious metals, but in human lives, systematically consumed in the empire's relentless hunger for both Nubian gold and the Nubian people who knew how to find it. Every stone in the pyramids was lifted by invisible hands. Every bushel of grain harvested by forgotten fingers. Every fine linen thread spun by nameless workers. Ancient Egypt wasn't built by anonymous laborers. It was built by deliberately anonymized people. The entire civilization rested on a foundation of trafficked humans, whose contributions were systematically erased from the historical record. But this erasure wasn't accidental. Therefore, it was strategic. By removing the human element from the labor narrative, Egypt created the illusion that its monuments, agriculture, and crafts emerged through divine favor rather than brutal exploitation. You're standing in a wheat field in the Nile Delta. The sun hammers down like a physical weight. Around you, dozens of workers bend at the waist, cutting stalks with small sickles. Their movements are practiced, mechanical. Egyptian overseers watch from shaded platforms, tallying the harvest. None of these field workers appear in the beautiful tomb paintings depicting agricultural abundance. In those artistic scenes, the wheat seems to harvest itself or is collected by generic figures with no identity. The real human cost of feeding Egypt has been carefully cropped out of the frame. Recent excavations at Giza have revealed extensive worker barracks that could house thousands of laborers who built the pyramids, with evidence of organized medical care for injuries and standardized food rations. Historians still argue whether the majority of these workers were temporarily conscripted peasants fulfilling labor tax obligations, or if they were predominantly permanent unfree laborers, acquired through trafficking and maintained in a state of perpetual servitude. The scale of invisible labor in ancient Egypt staggers the imagination. Conservative estimates suggest at least 30% of the population existed in some form of unfree status. That's hundreds of thousands of people working fields, quarries, construction sites, workshops, and households while being deliberately excluded from Egypt's self-representation. Official art shows pharaohs, nobles, and priests. It shows Egyptian peasants in generic form, but the vast unfree workforce appears only as tools, extensions of Egyptian will, rather than people with agency or identity. It's as if Amazon warehouse workers were removed from all company documents and replaced with floating packages that somehow sort themselves. The construction projects alone required human resources that defy comprehension. The Great Pyramid wasn't a weekend DIY project with some friends and a few beers. It required approximately 100,000 workers over 20 years. Each of those massive limestone blocks weighing tons had to be cut, transported, and positioned by human muscle. Egyptologists used to promote the myth of enthusiastic volunteers building national monuments out of patriotic fervor. Modern analysis has destroyed that comfortable fiction. The people who built the pyramids were as unfree as the stones they carried. At least the stones got to rest occasionally. One particularly odd detail emerged from a tomb painting in Rekhmira's tomb showing textile production. The artist initially painted actual chains on workers, but later modified them to look like decorative belts. Apparently, even Egyptian propaganda ministers occasionally let the mask slip and had to employ the ancient equivalent of Photoshop to maintain the approved narrative. No, those aren't restraints. They're fashionable accessories. The workers love them so much they never take them off, especially when trying to leave. Agricultural labor consumed the largest number of unfree workers. Egypt's legendary grain production didn't happen through magical Nile flooding alone. It required backbreaking human effort: plowing, planting, weeding, irrigating, harvesting, threshing, storing. Field workers lived in designated labor villages, their movements restricted, their output carefully measured. Archaeological evidence shows these agricultural workers received just enough calories to maintain productivity, approximately 2,000 daily, mostly from bread and beer. Not starvation, but certainly not abundance. It's like calculating the minimum fuel needed to keep a human machine operational, rather than the nutrition required for health and well-being. Textile production represented another massive labor sink deliberately hidden from view. Egypt's legendary linen didn't spin itself. Production required multiple stages: harvesting flax, retting the plants, separating fibers, spinning thread, weaving cloth, cutting garments. Each step performed by specialized workers, many of them women and children whose contributions vanish in Egypt's official narrative. The finest linen, so sheer it was called woven air, came from workshops filled with trafficked foreign women selected for exceptional manual dexterity. Their eyes failed from years of detailed work in dim light. Their fingers developed permanent deformities. But the Egyptian nobility just enjoyed the floating sensation of nearly transparent fabric without considering the human cost of their comfort. Sort of like modern fast fashion, but with more obvious slavery and fewer Instagram influencers. The mining and quarrying operations consumed human lives at terrifying rates. Stone for monuments, copper for tools, gold for decoration, all extracted by workers who rarely survived more than a few years in these conditions. Remote desert quarries operated like labor camps, with workers housed in rudimentary shelters, given minimal rations, and worked until exhaustion. Escape was nearly impossible. The surrounding desert ensured death for anyone attempting to flee. These weren't jobs. They were death sentences with productivity quotas. Transportation infrastructure relied entirely on human muscle. Egypt had no wheels until much later in its history. No pulleys, no mechanical advantage, just people, thousands of them, hauling stone blocks on sleds, rowing cargo boats against the current, carrying goods on their backs. The famous image of the Colossus being dragged by ropes. Each of those tiny figures represents a real person whose name, hopes, and suffering were deliberately erased from history. It's like if we depicted Amazon deliveries as packages floating to your door without acknowledging the delivery drivers destroying their bodies to get them there. The domestic sphere required perhaps the most intimate form of invisible labor. Household servants prepared food, cleaned living spaces, maintained gardens, raised children, managed daily logistics. Many were women and children working literally within arm's reach of the Egyptian family they served, yet remaining socially invisible. They existed in a strange liminal space, physically present but conceptually absent. Tomb paintings might show a noble woman being dressed by disembodied hands. The servant is rendered as merely functional appendages rather than a complete human. It's the ultimate objectification, not even acknowledging the whole person, just the useful parts. What makes this erasure particularly effective is how it persists even today. Modern documentaries marvel at Egyptian engineering while glossing over the human cost. Museum displays celebrate artistic achievements without acknowledging the unfree hands that created them. Popular imagination still clings to the myth of willing workers, rather than confronting the reality of systematic human trafficking that made Egyptian civilization possible. We've inherited not just Egypt's architectural wonders, but also their propaganda about how those wonders came to exist. The Egyptian language itself facilitated this erasure. Terms for unfree people were often euphemistic: servants of the estate, dependents, followers. Official records listed them as resources rather than people. Accounting papyri tallied them alongside livestock and goods. Their humanity dissolved in bureaucratic language designed to normalize their exploitation. This linguistic sleight of hand transformed human trafficking into administrative efficiency. It's like how modern corporations call employees human resources or assets, except with more obvious ownership and fewer performance reviews. Some specialized unfree workers achieved limited recognition. Particularly skilled artisans might be named in records. Trusted household servants occasionally received mention. But these exceptions represented a tiny fraction of the unfree population. The vast majority lived, worked, and died without leaving any mark on the historical record beyond the monuments they built, the fields they tended, and the goods they produced. Their individual stories vanished, leaving only the fruits of their coerced labor. Archaeological evidence offers our only window into these invisible lives. Worker villages excavated near major projects reveal crowded living conditions, basic diets, evidence of physical strain, and high mortality. Skeletal remains tell stories the official record conceals: compressed vertebrae from carrying heavy loads, arthritis in young adults from repetitive labor, healed fractures from accidents or punishment. These bones represent our only access to lives deliberately erased from history, the physical evidence of suffering that Egyptian propaganda worked so hard to conceal. Perhaps most disturbing is how this erasure served Egypt's theological narrative. By removing the human element, Egypt's achievements could be attributed directly to divine favor. The gods blessed Egypt with abundance, with monuments, with craftsmanship. This convenient theology masked the uncomfortable reality that Egypt's splendor came not from divine intervention, but from systematic human exploitation. Religious justification transformed trafficking victims from exploited people into necessary components of cosmic order. Their suffering not just normalized, but sanctified. When we marvel at Egypt's achievements today, we unconsciously participate in this ancient propaganda. We see the monuments without seeing the broken bodies that built them. We admire the artifacts without acknowledging the coerced hands that crafted them. We praise Egyptian civilization without recognizing the human foundation it consumed. Every golden treasure, every stone temple, every painted tomb rests upon an invisible pedestal built from trafficked lives deliberately erased from history. The greatest disappearing act in human civilization, where an entire exploited workforce vanished not through magic, but through methodical historical erasure designed to ensure we would remember the glory while forgetting its human cost. The gods of Egypt didn't just accept human sacrifices, they owned them. Temples weren't merely places of worship, but massive trafficking operations with divine branding. The religious economy controlled vast numbers of unfree people who labored not for earthly masters, but for immortal ones. But this spiritual veneer didn't make their chains any lighter. Therefore, it made their bondage more inescapable. How do you rebel against a god? The temple trafficking system represented exploitation's perfect form. Servitude sanctified as sacred duty, exploitation repackaged as divine privilege, an escape rendered not just physically impossible but spiritually forbidden. You're standing in the vast temple complex of Karnak. The stone pillars rise like petrified forests. Incense hangs heavy in the air. Around you move thousands of workers, sweeping floors, carrying offerings, preparing food, tending gardens. Their faces are blank, their movements mechanical. You notice small tattoos or brands on their foreheads or hands, marks of divine ownership. These people don't just work for the temple, they are the temple's property. Their labor isn't service but obligation. Their existence belongs not to themselves, but to Amun-Ra, whose earthly representatives collect the profits of their toil. Archaeological evidence from temple complexes reveals massive infrastructure designed to house, control, and exploit unfree labor. The Temple of Amun at Karnak maintained specialized barracks capable of housing over 2,000 dedicated temple servants, with administrative papyri documenting the acquisition of new divine servants through warfare, purchase, and dedicated children. Historians still argue whether temple servants experienced better treatment than those owned by private individuals, or if the religious context actually worsened their condition by adding theological justification to their exploitation. Temple economics functioned on an industrial scale that would make modern corporations jealous. By the New Kingdom, major temples controlled approximately 30% of Egypt's arable land and owned tens of thousands of unfree workers. These weren't small religious operations, but massive economic enterprises with divine CEOs and very human management teams. The god Amun didn't personally collect the profits. His priests did, maintaining luxurious lifestyles while the temple's human property lived in crowded barracks and worked from dawn until dusk. It's like a spiritual multi-level marketing scheme where the person at the top of the pyramid doesn't even exist in material form, but still somehow ends up with all the money. The acquisition methods for temple slaves were particularly insidious. Some came through military campaigns, with a percentage of captives dedicated to divine service. Others were purchased directly from markets, but a disturbing number were children dedicated by desperate parents seeking divine favor. Imagine thinking your kid might have a better life if you signed them over to divine ownership, the ancient equivalent of hoping your child becomes a child star, except with more mandatory labor and fewer residual checks. The temple tattoo system represents one of ancient Egypt's most visible ownership markers. Small blue tattoos, usually in the form of divine symbols, were applied to the foreheads, hands, or shoulders of temple servants. These weren't optional fashion statements, but permanent brands of divine ownership. Each major deity had distinct markings: the ankh for some, specific animals for others. The tattoos weren't just identification but theological restraints, suggesting that escape wouldn't just be physically punished, but spiritually condemned. It's like having your employee ID, tracking device, and religious guilt all combined in one convenient skin modification. Did you know that certain temple servants underwent rituals where they symbolically died to their previous identity before being reborn as divine property? One particularly strange papyrus describes a ceremony where new temple acquisitions had their birth names written on clay tablets that were then ceremonially broken, after which they received new temple names reflecting their divine owner. Talk about an extreme onboarding process. Modern companies just make you sit through boring orientation videos instead of ritually destroying your identity. The hierarchy within temple slavery was elaborately stratified. At the top were specialized ritual participants, musicians, dancers, incense bearers, who performed visible roles in religious ceremonies. Their condition might almost appear privileged to outside observers. Below them came skilled craftspeople, maintaining temple treasures and infrastructure. Then administrative servants managing documents and supplies. At the bottom existed the mass of general laborers, cleaners, agricultural workers, construction crews, whose lives consisted of endless toil with minimal recognition. Each level received different treatment, different housing, different food allocations, creating divisions that prevented unified resistance. Women in temple service faced unique circumstances. Some served as ritual dancers or musicians, roles carrying limited status. Others worked in textile production, creating the fine linen used in ceremonies and as divine clothing. A specific category called God's Wives, or divine adoratrices, occupied a strange middle ground, technically dedicated to the deity in a form of sacred marriage, yet actually serving as political appointments controlled by royal families. For most women in temple service, however, reality meant hard labor and vulnerability to exploitation by male temple officials. The sacred setting didn't provide protection, but rather an environment where abuse could be masked as religious obligation. Children born to temple servants inherited their parents' status automatically. They became divine property from birth, never knowing any other existence. Temple schools trained these children from early ages, separating them into specialized tracks based on assessed abilities. The most intelligent might receive scribal training to serve as temple administrators. The most attractive might be groomed for ceremonial roles. The strongest were directed toward labor divisions. None were asked their preferences. Their potential was assessed as dispassionately as farmers might evaluate young livestock for various potential uses. The economic output of temple trafficking operations staggers modern comprehension. Major temples functioned as combination factory, farm conglomerate, real estate empire, and labor contractor. They produced vast agricultural surpluses on divine-owned lands, worked by divine-owned people. They manufactured textiles, pottery, furniture, and ritual objects in specialized workshops. They rented out their human property to private citizens needing temporary labor. The profits flowed to the priestly class, who served as the earthly management team for absent divine owners. It's essentially a massive corporation with an imaginary CEO who never shows up for board meetings but somehow still gets all the stock options. The psychological control mechanisms were particularly effective. Temple servants weren't just bound by physical restraints, but by theological ones. Resistance wasn't merely disobedience, but sacrilege. Escape wasn't just flight from ownership, but from divine protection. The gods saw everything, knew everything, controlled everything, including your fate after death. How do you rebel against omniscient beings who control your eternal destiny? This spiritual dimension added an extra layer of restraint no physical chain could match. Modern employers try to build company loyalty with pizza parties and casual Fridays. Egyptian temples just convinced workers that divine beings would torture them for eternity if they complained about working conditions. What makes temple trafficking particularly perverse is how effectively it has been whitewashed by history. Modern descriptions talk about temple personnel or dedicated servants, rather than acknowledging the fundamental unfreedom at the system's core. Artistic representations show smiling figures bringing offerings, not the reality of forced labor. The spiritual veneer has successfully obscured the exploitation beneath, allowing contemporary observers to admire religious devotion without recognizing the trafficked humans who made elaborate religious practices possible. For all their spiritual trappings, temples operated on brutally practical labor management. Papyri document punishment systems for underperforming workers, ration reductions for missed quotas, physical discipline for rule violations. The divine might be merciful in theological texts, but their earthly representatives maintained control through very human methods of coercion. One particularly revealing administrative document from the Ramesseum temple matter-of-factly lists 12 rods broken in correction of temple servants as a monthly inventory item, alongside lamp oil and incense. Apparently, the gods required both aromatherapy and corporal punishment to keep their earthly operations running smoothly. The lives of those owned by temples followed predictable patterns. They lived in designated areas, often within temple complexes, but separate from sacred spaces. Their movements were restricted, their activities monitored. They received sufficient food to maintain productivity, but rarely more. Their work cycles followed religious calendars, intensifying around major festivals when temples required additional labor for elaborate ceremonies. Their individual identities dissolved into their functional roles. They became not people, but positions, not individuals, but operational components in a divine machine. The ultimate irony. Many temple servants participated in creating the very religious artwork and texts that justified their own exploitation. They carved scenes showing harmonious divine order while living under systematic control. They painted images of happy offering bearers while experiencing anything but happiness. They inscribed theological justifications for a stratified society while occupying its lowest levels. They literally built the ideological framework that normalized their own unfreedom, constructing both the physical temples and the belief systems that kept them bound to those temples. Most temple servants lived and died within the same complex, their entire existence contained within sacred walls. They never knew life outside divine ownership. Their children followed the same paths, creating generations of unfree temple families whose history disappeared into the general religious narrative. The sheer duration of these human dynasties of exploitation, family lines owned by temples for centuries, represents one of history's longest-running trafficking operations, given theological justification and architectural permanence. When you visit Egyptian temples today, you're witnessing not just religious monuments, but the administrative headquarters of sophisticated trafficking networks. Those massive stone columns were positioned by unfree hands. Those intricate carvings were created by people who couldn't refuse the work. Those sacred spaces were maintained by generations of individuals who had no choice but to serve. The awe-inspiring architecture testifies not just to religious devotion, but to the systematic exploitation that made such devotion architecturally expressible. Each beautifully preserved temple stands as a monument to an uncomfortable truth: that religious institutions were not just passive beneficiaries of human trafficking, but active participants in its most sophisticated form. The divine economy didn't just accept the fruits of exploitation, it developed and perfected a system where unfreedom became sanctified, where ownership was sacralized, and where the ultimate authority wasn't a human master who might be resisted, but a divine one who could never be escaped. A perfect system of control where the chains binding the unfree were not just physical shackles, but the invisible restraints of theological obligation. Some Egyptians never purchased a slave. They simply owned their children. Egypt's most renewable resource wasn't the annual Nile flood, but the offspring of the unfree. Children born to enslaved parents inherited their status automatically, creating generations of bondage through biological reproduction. But this wasn't just convenient coincidence. Therefore, it was deliberate reproductive management. Egypt didn't just traffic in existing humans, it manufactured new ones through controlled breeding programs that make modern dating apps look ethically pristine by comparison. You're witnessing a birth in a servant quarter of a noble household. The mother labors on a reed mat, attended by other female servants. No midwife has been called. Childbirth among the unfree is routine, unremarkable. The household steward waits nearby, tablet ready. This birth isn't a family celebration, but an inventory update. The newborn represents not new life, but new property. Another entry in the household ledger. Another asset acquired without purchase cost. The child's first cry announces not its arrival into a family, but into an ownership system it will never escape. Archaeological evidence from servant quarters at sites like Deir el-Medina reveals distinct family units among unfree populations, with children raised in multi-generational households of similar status. Skeletal remains of children show early onset of labor-related stress injuries, with some as young as 6 exhibiting bone deformities consistent with carrying heavy loads or repetitive craft activities. Historians still argue whether Egyptian masters actively encouraged reproduction among their unfree populations, primarily for economic benefit, or if family formation among the unfree was tolerated mainly as a social control mechanism that reduced escape attempts and resistance. The mathematics of inherited bondage created exponential growth in Egypt's unfree population. A single captured foreign woman might produce 5 children, who might each produce 5 more, creating 25 grandchildren, all born into bondage without any acquisition cost beyond basic maintenance. This biological multiplication transformed human trafficking from a continuous acquisition requirement to a self-sustaining system. Why raid foreign villages when your existing property reproduces itself? It's like discovering your kitchen appliances can make baby kitchen appliances, eliminating the need to ever visit Williams-Sonoma again. Reproductive control operated differently based on status and setting. In elite households, reproduction among servants might be carefully managed, certain pairings encouraged, others forbidden. In labor camps and agricultural settings, control was often looser, but surveillance remained. Temple servants operated under religious regulations governing their reproductive activities. The common thread: the unfree never controlled their own reproductive choices. Their body's creative capacity belonged to their owners, just like their labor. Imagine your boss having opinions about who you should date based on what skills your potential children might contribute to the company's 5-year plan. The bureaucracy of inherited bondage was meticulous. Birth records for unfree children listed not just date of birth, but ownership lineage. Female child born to Nubian kitchen servant owned by Amenhotep, son of Hapu. identity defined from first breath by nested layers of possession. These records tracked valuable human assets through generations, ensuring ownership clarity as property passed from one Egyptian master to another through inheritance or sale. Some noble families maintained servant genealogies extending 5 or 6 generations, tracking valuable traits like they were breeding prize hunting dogs rather than managing human beings. Did you know that some Egyptian noble households maintained what archaeologists call servant nurseries? Dedicated facilities where unfree children from multiple households were raised together under specialized supervision. One particularly unusual example discovered at a villa near Memphis shows a walled compound with evidence of up to 40 children being raised in age-segregated groups, with specialized trainers teaching skills based on projected adult roles. It's essentially ancient Egyptian daycare, except instead of finger painting and nap time, the curriculum included introductory food preparation and basic subservience training. The psychological impact of birth-based bondage created different challenges than capture-based trafficking. Children born into unfreedom never experienced the trauma of status loss. They had no memories of liberty to haunt them. But they also had no concept of alternatives, no framework for understanding that their condition wasn't natural or inevitable. Their worldview developed entirely within a system designed to convince them of their proper place at the bottom of a divinely ordained hierarchy. It's like growing up in a cult, except the cult is an entire civilization, and there's no deprogramming available. The training of unfree children began shockingly early. By age 3 or 4, they were assigned simple tasks, carrying small items, sorting materials, running messages. By 5 or 6, their training specialized based on projected adult roles. By 8, many worked full productive days. Their education wasn't about developing potential, but about maximizing usefulness to owners. Play existed not as childhood right, but as training mechanism. Games taught dexterity needed for craft work. Stories inculcated proper deference to authority. Egyptian owners didn't see children as developing humans, but as unfinished products requiring appropriate shaping. The role of unfree mothers in this system was particularly heartbreaking. They gave birth to children they couldn't protect from exploitation. They taught children to survive in a system they couldn't change. Many unfree mothers deliberately instilled compliant behaviors in their children, knowing that resistance led to punishment or separation. Their love expressed itself not in fighting the system, but in teaching children to navigate it with minimum damage. Modern parenting blogs debate free-range versus helicopter approaches. Unfree Egyptian mothers had to practice something more like, "Please don't get yourself killed or sold away," parenting. Family separation remained a constant threat hovering over unfree households. Children could be reassigned to different locations based on labor needs. Particularly attractive or skilled children might be selected for household service far from their birth families. Punishment for parental infractions might include child reassignment. The threat created a powerful control mechanism. Parents complied to maintain family unity. Children obeyed to avoid causing trouble that might separate them from parents. It's the ancient equivalent of, "If you don't behave, we'll send you to boarding school." Except the boarding school is permanent servitude in a distant province with no holiday visits. The socialization of unfree children created complex identity issues. Many were mixed race, born to foreign captive mothers and Egyptian fathers, whether acknowledged or not. Their appearance marked them as different from both full Egyptian children and newly captured foreigners. They spoke perfect Egyptian, but remained excluded from Egyptian identity. They had no connection to their ancestral cultures, but weren't accepted into Egyptian culture. They existed in a liminal space, Egyptian in language and behavior, but perpetually other in status and perception. Particularly disturbing was the casual acceptance of this reproductive bondage system in Egyptian thought. Legal texts, moral literature, and religious writing all accepted, inherited unfreedom as natural and proper. No ethical questions arose about children born into bondage through no action of their own. The system wasn't seen as requiring justification. It was simply how the world worked, part of Ma'at, cosmic order, rather than a human choice that could be made differently. Even Egypt's most profound philosophical texts never questioned whether owning someone based solely on their birth circumstances might be problematic. The economic efficiency of reproduction-based trafficking proved irresistible. Purchasing an adult required significant investment. Capturing required military expenditure. But children born to existing property, pure profit after minimal maintenance costs. The economic logic was unassailable if you accepted the fundamental premise that humans could be property. Once that ethical line was crossed, inherited bondage became not just acceptable, but financially optimal. It's like discovering you can generate passive income by having your assets reproduce themselves. The ultimate pyramid scheme, where the pyramids are actually social structures. Some children born into bondage managed limited status improvements through skill development or owner favor. A talented child might receive specialized training, gaining value and marginally better treatment. Household servants' children might form emotional bonds with the Egyptian children they grew up alongside, creating complex relationships that weren't quite friendship, but occasionally mimicked its forms. The occasional exceptional individual might rise to administrative positions, achieving relative privilege while remaining fundamentally unfree. These exceptions didn't challenge the system, but strengthened it by creating false hope and internal competition. The inherited bondage system outlasted individual pharaohs, dynasties, and even conquests. When Hyksos rulers took control of northern Egypt, they adopted the system rather than changing it. When Egypt expanded into empire, the system expanded with it. When Egypt eventually declined, the system continued under new management. The mechanisms of human reproduction remained too valuable as property generation to abandon, regardless of who controlled the Nile Valley. The system demonstrated remarkable resilience precisely because it had embedded itself in the most fundamental human process, the creation of new life. What makes birth-based bondage particularly insidious is how it naturalized unfreedom. Children born into the system had no point of comparison, no conceptual framework for alternatives. Their bondage wasn't an event, but a state of being. Not something that happened to them, but something they were. The system didn't need to justify itself to those born within it, because it shaped the very mental categories through which they understood the world. Egyptian owners didn't need physical chains for those who couldn't imagine freedom in the first place. The reproductive capacity of the unfree didn't just maintain existing numbers, it expanded them. Egypt's unfree population grew not just through conquest and purchase, but through birth, creating exponential growth across generations. This biological multiplication transformed trafficking from continuous acquisition to self-perpetuating system. Why seek new foreign captives when existing property reproduces itself? The ultimate renewable resource wasn't gold or grain, but human beings creating more human beings, all pre-designated as property from their first breath. When modern visitors marvel at Egypt's monuments, they rarely consider how many of those who built them never chose their profession, but were born into it through a reproductive bondage system that predetermined their entire life path. They don't think about the children who never had a chance to choose, who entered the world already owned, whose future was decided before they drew their first breath. The greatest tragedy isn't just that Egypt trafficked in humans, but that it created a self-perpetuating system where bondage wasn't imposed from outside, but inherited from within. A perfect exploitation machine that didn't just consume existing lives, but manufactured new ones, specifically designed for a lifetime of servitude they could neither escape nor even properly comprehend. Freedom had a geography problem in ancient Egypt. The desert killed as efficiently as any guard. The river flowed one way, the wrong way for most escape attempts. Mountains and seas created natural barriers more effective than walls. But physical obstacles weren't the most insurmountable. Therefore, the greatest prison was administrative. Egypt invented bureaucratic systems of human control millennia before computers made surveillance easy. Papyrus trails, checkpoint systems, and identity documentation created an escape-proof kingdom long before digital tracking existed. You're an unfree Nubian contemplating escape from a noble household in Thebes. The physical challenges alone seem impossible. The desert to the east and west means certain death without supplies you can't access. The river flows north, away from your homeland. The delta's maze of waterways is patrolled and unfamiliar. The Mediterranean offers no passage home. But even if you somehow manage the geography, the administrative barriers remain. Your distinctive appearance, your lack of travel documents, your inability to explain your presence to patrols. The system has created multiple redundant barriers. Your body is just one type of prison. Bureaucracy is the other. Written documentation of Egypt's administrative control systems appears in numerous papyri from the New Kingdom, detailing checkpoint procedures, identity verification methods, and punishments for unauthorized movement. The Turin Papyrus describes an elaborate system of travel documentation required even for free Egyptians, with specialized permits needed for those traveling between administrative districts. Historians still argue whether these systems were developed primarily for tax collection purposes and later adapted for controlling unfree populations, or if human trafficking control was an intended purpose from their inception. The Egyptian escape prevention system operated with remarkable sophistication for a pre-modern state. Checkpoints controlled all major roads, particularly at administrative boundaries, desert routes, and waterway junctions. Travelers needed documentation explaining their identity, purpose, and authorization. Those accompanying goods required inventory lists and tax receipts. The unfree caught without proper documentation faced immediate return to owners, plus additional punishment. It was TSA security theater, but with actual consequences beyond missing your flight and having your shampoo confiscated. Physical appearance created additional barriers. Ethnic differences were immediately visible in a relatively homogeneous society. Nubians, Syrians, Libyans, and others bore distinctive features, marking them as likely unfree if traveling alone. Many unfree people carried permanent bodily modifications, brands, tattoos, distinctive hairstyles, specifically designed to identify their status. Attempting to hide these marks constituted a separate offense with its own punishments. It's like trying to escape while wearing a neon jumpsuit with your owner's name and address helpfully printed on the back. Egypt's geographical realities created natural containment zones. The Nile Valley isn't just a river, but a narrow, fertile strip surrounded by lethal desert. Attempting to cross meant certain death without substantial supplies and knowledge. The river itself offered potential escape, but its northward flow meant those from southern regions would travel deeper into Egyptian territory, not toward home. The Mediterranean coast presented a barrier rather than an escape route for most. It's like being imprisoned on an island where the only boat sails in the wrong direction and the water is filled with hungry crocodiles wearing Egyptian military uniforms. One particularly odd escape deterrent appears in a New Kingdom papyrus describing ghost patrols, small groups of officials who would travel disguised as merchants, stopping travelers, and suddenly revealing themselves as authorities checking documentation, sort of like ancient Egyptian undercover cops, except with fewer rights for the detained and more creative punishment options. Surprise! This isn't actually a pottery trading caravan, it's your worst nightmare in bureaucratic form. Now show me your travel papyrus or things get really unpleasant. The psychological barriers to escape often proved more effective than physical ones. The unfree were systematically taught that the world beyond Egyptian control was chaotic, dangerous, and lethal. Religious instruction emphasized that leaving Egypt meant abandoning divine protection. Those captured in foreign lands and brought to Egypt had experienced trauma that discouraged return journeys. And perhaps most effectively, family ties created emotional anchors. Attempting escape often meant abandoning children, parents, or spouses who couldn't come along. Why build walls when you can build psychological cages that people enforce themselves? For those rare individuals who attempted escape despite the barriers, Egypt maintained specialized retrieval agents, essentially ancient bounty hunters authorized to track, capture, and return human property. These weren't random thugs, but trained professionals who understood travel routes, carried proper documentation, and operated with state backing. Their success rates were remarkably high. Some recovery papyri claim 80% capture rates for escaped unfree people. When captured, escapees faced escalating punishments, designed both to penalize and to make future attempts physically more difficult. Think of them as particularly efficient repo men, except instead of repossessing your car for missed payments, they're repossessing your actual person. The documentation systems supporting this control apparatus were impressively thorough. Unfree individuals appeared in multiple record types: owner inventories, tax documents, work assignments, temple records. These overlapping documentation systems made existing off the grid nearly impossible in a society obsessed with writing everything down. Escaping the physical location of bondage didn't equal escaping the administrative system that defined and enforced that bondage. It's like trying to delete your digital footprint today, except instead of Facebook knowing your shopping habits, it's an entire civilization knowing you're someone else's property. Collective punishment served as another powerful deterrent. When someone escaped, consequences often fell on those left behind: family members, work unit associates, even unrelated individuals from the same origin. This created social pressure against escape attempts. Your freedom might cost others dearly. The system cleverly weaponized human connections, turning care for others into another control mechanism. It's the ancient equivalent of, if anyone leaves early, the whole class gets detention. Except detention is a brutal beating and the class is your children. Foreign diplomatic agreements further constrained escape possibilities. Egypt maintained treaties with neighboring powers, specifically including clauses about returning escaped servants. These international agreements created transboundary enforcement, meaning that even if you somehow crossed borders, you might be legally returned. No adjacent territory offered guaranteed sanctuary. Reaching truly safe haven required traveling distances that were practically impossible given period transportation limitations. Your ownership status had diplomatic recognition, perhaps history's least appealing form of international legal protection. Even natural disasters and wars, events that typically create opportunities for escape through disruption of normal control systems, were counteracted with specialized contingency protocols. Papyri describe emergency procedures during floods, droughts, or military threats, with specific provisions for securing unfree populations. One document details how household servants should be secured during emergencies before even valuable property. A telling priority order. Chaos didn't create freedom, it just activated different control systems designed specifically for chaotic conditions. The combination of geographic, administrative, psychological, and diplomatic barriers created what historians call layered containment. Multiple overlapping systems, ensuring that if one failed, others would still prevent escape. This redundancy made successful escape vanishingly rare. The few documented cases typically involved exceptional circumstances, individuals with specialized knowledge, unusual access to resources, or rare opportunities created by political disruption. These exceptions proved the rule. The system worked with remarkable efficiency for its time. What made this system particularly impressive wasn't just its effectiveness, but its sustainability. It operated without modern surveillance technology, without photography, without instant communication. It relied on systems of documentation, verification, and human implementation that proved remarkably reliable across centuries. The administrative apparatus controlling human movement functioned so well that its basic patterns would be recognizable to modern border control agents, showing how little the fundamental techniques of human movement restriction have changed despite technological advancement. The psychological impact of living within an inescapable system cannot be overstated. Imagine existing in a world where freedom isn't just difficult to achieve, but conceptually almost impossible to imagine, where every direction offers not opportunity, but barriers, where the administrative system defining you as property has more permanence than the individuals who temporarily own you. This wasn't just physical confinement, but existential containment, a comprehensive denial of possibility that constrained not just bodies, but imagination itself. For the vast majority of unfree people in ancient Egypt, escape remained a theoretical concept rather than a practical possibility. The layered barriers, geographical, administrative, social, psychological, created a system where freedom existed as an abstract idea rather than an achievable goal. Most adapted to their reality, finding small spaces for dignity and meaning within fundamentally unfree lives. They sought not escape, but survivable accommodation within a system designed specifically to make alternative futures unimaginable. When people today talk about escaping the system, they usually mean quitting their jobs or moving off social media. They haven't experienced what it means to live in a civilization engineered at every level to make your freedom physically impossible, administratively trackable, socially punishable, and psychologically unthinkable. Egypt's greatest innovation wasn't its pyramids or mummification, but its creation of history's first truly comprehensive human containment system. One so effective that many within it stopped seeing the barriers, not because they disappeared, but because they had been internalized so completely that freedom became not just unreachable, but almost inconceivable. Egypt didn't hide its human trafficking. It celebrated it on temple walls. Massive stone reliefs show bound foreigners presented to pharaohs. Tomb paintings display rows of captives labeled by origin. Administrative papyri document human acquisitions with cold precision. But modern eyes often miss what's literally carved in stone. Therefore, we've sanitized history, filtering ancient atrocity through the soft focus lens of archaeological romanticism. The evidence screams at us from museum walls. We just don't want to hear what it's saying. You're standing in the British Museum, admiring a beautifully preserved Egyptian relief. Tourists around you murmur about the artistic achievement and cultural sophistication. But you're looking at a trafficking receipt carved in limestone. The scene shows a military campaign with bound captives being counted and recorded by scribes. Their hands are tied behind their backs. Some have ropes around their necks. Children are separated from parents. This isn't abstract art. It's a business transaction report documenting human beings reduced to inventory. The museum placard calls it a victory scene, without mentioning the fundamental reality. You're looking at an advertisement for systematic human exploitation. Archaeological evidence from sites throughout Egypt reveals how thoroughly human trafficking was documented in official records. The tomb of Rekhmire, vizier under Thutmose III, contains extensive scenes showing foreign captives organized by ethnic origin, with accompanying hieroglyphic texts listing precise numbers: 311 Syrians, 87 Nubians, all categorized as royal acquisitions. Historians still argue whether these prominently displayed trafficking records served primarily as status symbols, demonstrating the king's power, or if they functioned as official administrative records meant to document royal wealth for governmental purposes. The linguistic evidence is equally damning. Egyptian texts don't hide trafficking behind euphemisms, they celebrate it as achievement. Royal inscriptions boast of capturing living bodies and bringing back many hands, the latter a grim reference to counting severed hands from the dead to tally battle casualties separately from captured living bodies. Temple texts thank gods for delivering foreign lands into the king's hands, a theological framing for imperial human trafficking. The evidence isn't hidden in obscure fragments, but prominently displayed in Egypt's most important monuments. It's like finding a corporate annual report where the CEO proudly highlights the company's success in human rights violations while thanking the board for their support. What makes this historical blindness particularly perverse is how we've transformed trafficking documentation into gift shop merchandise. That museum postcard showing Ramesses II smiting enemies. That's a trafficking scene. The refrigerator magnet with exotic foreigners bringing tribute. Those are trafficked humans being transferred as property. We've literally commodified the documentation of human commodification. Tourists buy tote bags decorated with scenes of human misery without recognizing what they're carrying. It's like wearing a t-shirt with a prison transfer document printed on it because you think the vintage bureaucratic aesthetic looks cool. Museum displays perpetuate this historical laundering. Exhibit texts describe captives, servants, or foreign workers, rather than acknowledging the fundamental unfreedom these terms disguise. Elaborate discussions of artistic techniques and religious symbolism draw attention away from the basic human reality depicted. The aesthetic appreciation of trafficking documentation becomes a form of ethical distancing, allowing viewers to admire the artistry while ignoring the atrocity. We've developed sophisticated cultural mechanisms for not seeing what's directly in front of us. Did you know one particularly bizarre example of this historical blind spot involves a famous wall painting from the tomb of Rekhmire that shows tribute bearers bringing exotic goods to Egypt? The scene is reproduced in countless art history books as an example of Egyptian trade networks. What most descriptions conveniently omit is that several bearers are shown with binding ropes partially visible beneath their tribute loads, and the accompanying text explicitly mentions their children are carried as permanent tribute, making it clear this isn't trade but human trafficking thinly disguised as diplomatic exchange. It's like describing a prison labor program as a vocational opportunity while cropping the chains out of the promotional photos. The archaeological obsession with elite Egyptian perspectives compounds the problem. We excavate tombs of officials who manage trafficking operations, translate texts written by those who benefited from the system, and preserve art commissioned by trafficking's beneficiaries. The archaeological record privileges the exploiter's perspective, while the exploited remain largely voiceless. This isn't just about what survives. It's about what we choose to prioritize, display, translate, and teach. Imagine if future archaeologists studied 21st century human trafficking exclusively through the financial records of traffickers, treating their account books as neutral historical documents worthy of aesthetic appreciation. Contemporary scholarly language often perpetuates this invisibility. Academic papers discuss labor organization rather than forced labor, population transfers rather than mass abductions, servant acquisition rather than human trafficking. This sanitized vocabulary doesn't emerge from evidence, but from interpretive choices that soften historical realities into palatable abstractions. The same evidence could be described accurately with terms reflecting the lived experience of the trafficked, rather than the administrative perspective of traffickers. It's like describing the Atlantic slave trade as involuntary migration services. Technically not incorrect, but morally and historically bankrupt. Popular media presentations compound the problem. Documentaries show Egyptian monuments rising from the desert as if by magic, with perhaps a brief mention of workers or laborers. Movies depict ancient Egyptian life with enslaved people as background scenery rather than fundamental economic infrastructure. Educational materials for children describe pyramid construction as a national achievement without addressing the human cost. These representations aren't just incomplete, they actively mislead by presenting trafficking-dependent achievements as generalized cultural accomplishments. It's like producing a documentary about a mansion's architectural features while carefully avoiding any mention that it was built entirely with stolen labor. The consequences of this historical blindness extend beyond academic accuracy. By sanitizing ancient trafficking, we create artificial distance between civilized past societies and contemporary human exploitation. We treat modern trafficking as aberrant, while normalizing historical variants as cultural practices worthy of uncritical admiration. This arbitrary moral distinction doesn't emerge from evidence, but from our psychological need to admire past achievements without confronting their human cost. We want to appreciate the pyramids without thinking about the broken bodies that built them. Perhaps most disturbing is how this willful blindness mirrors the original Egyptian strategy: Egyptian art deliberately depersonalized the trafficked, showing them as generic types rather than individuals, emphasizing their foreign origin rather than their human commonality. Modern representations often reproduce this same dehumanization, treating ancient trafficking victims as historical abstractions rather than real people who suffered. We don't just fail to see the evidence, we unconsciously adopt the perspective of those who created it, perpetuating their dehumanizing gaze across millennia. The textual evidence becomes particularly damning when we examine administrative documents. Papyri matter-of-factly list living acquisitions alongside material goods. Estate inventories include unfree humans categorized by origin, skill, and age. Transfer documents record the movement of people as property. These aren't obscure texts, but routine bureaucratic records, preserved not because they were hidden, but because they were ordinary. The banality of this documentation reveals how thoroughly trafficking was normalized, not a shameful secret, but standard administrative practice. It's like finding a company's accounting software with a dedicated module for tracking human inventory, complete with depreciation schedules and replacement cost estimates. The archaeological evidence extends beyond documents and art to physical restraints preserved in the record. Excavations have uncovered metal ankle shackles, stone weights with rope attachment points, specialized restraint tools designed specifically for controlling human property. These aren't rare findings, but common artifacts appearing throughout Egyptian archaeological contexts. Their standardized design and widespread distribution reveal systematic production rather than exceptional use. We display these items in museums as artifacts rather than what they actually are, physical evidence of systematic human constraint designed specifically for trafficking operations. What makes this historical blindness particularly frustrating is that recognizing ancient trafficking doesn't require speculative interpretation or controversial theoretical frameworks. The evidence is explicit, abundant, and unambiguous. Egyptians themselves documented their trafficking activities thoroughly in both text and image. They didn't hide these practices or consider them shameful. They celebrated them as achievements worthy of permanent record. Our failure to see this evidence clearly says more about our psychological need to sanitize the past than about any legitimate evidentiary ambiguity. The ethical implications of this blindness extend to contemporary museum practices. Institutions worldwide display trafficking documentation without adequate contextualization. Artifacts created to celebrate human exploitation receive neutral or even admiring presentation. Human remains of trafficking victims are exhibited without acknowledgement of their unfree status or the systems that exploited them. These presentation choices aren't historically neutral, but represent continuing ethical failures to recognize past atrocity for what it was. It's like displaying implements of torture as examples of technological innovation without mentioning their actual purpose or human impact. When you next visit a museum exhibition on ancient Egypt, look at the evidence with fresh eyes. See the bound figures on temple walls. Notice the categorized foreigners in tomb paintings. Read the triumphant inscriptions boasting of human capture. The trafficking isn't hidden in esoteric evidence accessible only to specialists. It's literally carved in stone, painted on walls, written in texts displayed in museums worldwide. The evidence has always been hiding in plain sight, prominently displayed in public institutions, reproduced in coffee table books, visible to anyone willing to see what's actually there, rather than what cultural sanitization has taught us to see instead. History's cruel joke is that we admire the evidence of atrocity. Those perfect pyramids, those elegant temples, they're architectural marvels, but also crime scenes. Every stone has fingerprints we choose not to see. Every hieroglyph tells half a story. But the full narrative isn't carved in limestone. It's etched in broken bones that archaeologists keep finding beneath the splendor. We romanticize ancient Egypt, like it's some lost utopia with cool eyeliner and fun animal gods. The reality: it was a sophisticated trafficking network with excellent branding. Therefore, When we marvel at their achievements, we're applauding the outcome of systematic human exploitation. But this isn't just about correcting the historical record. It's about recognizing how easily we still fall for propaganda, even propaganda that's 3,000 years old and written in hieroglyphics. You're standing at Giza, watching the sunset paint the pyramids gold. Tourists around you take selfies, buy miniature replicas, listen to guides explain construction techniques. No one mentions the thousands who died building these monuments. No one acknowledges that these aren't just architectural achievements, but massive physical manifestations of a trafficking economy. We've been so thoroughly manipulated by Egyptian propaganda that we continue spreading it millennia after their civilization collapsed. It's like leaving a 5-star review for a restaurant that went out of business during the Bronze Age. Recent archaeological work at labor camps near major monument sites has revealed evidence of systematic human trafficking on an industrial scale, with specialized facilities designed to house thousands of unfree workers under controlled conditions. Skeletal remains show patterns of stress and injury consistent with forced labor, including compressed vertebrae, repetitive stress injuries, and improperly healed fractures. Historians still argue whether these workers should be classified as slaves in the traditional sense or as unfree laborers in a more complex system of obligation that doesn't neatly fit modern categorical definitions. What makes Egypt's trafficking system particularly insidious is how thoroughly it was integrated into every aspect of their civilization. This wasn't a peripheral practice or regrettable side effect of imperial expansion. It was a central organizing principle affecting economics, religion, art, administration, and military strategy. Modern observers try to separate Egypt's achievements from the trafficking that enabled them, but that's like trying to separate Amazon's success from its business model. The trafficking wasn't incidental to Egyptian civilization. It was fundamental to how it functioned and what it achieved. Our cultural blindness to Egyptian trafficking reveals our ongoing discomfort with exploitation's role in human achievement. We want clean narratives about ingenuity and cooperation, rather than messy truths about coercion and control. Museum displays carefully describe architectural techniques while glossing over the unfree status of those implementing them. Documentaries marvel at engineering precision without acknowledging the human cost of achieving it. It's like praising someone's impressive weight loss without mentioning their meth addiction. The results may be real, but the methods matter. Did you know that some Egyptian officials were actually buried with miniature models of their trafficking operations? One particularly unusual tomb, discovered near Memphis, contained detailed wooden sculptures showing captives being processed through various stages: initial capture, transportation, branding, and assignment to work areas. The deceased apparently wanted to bring his successful business model into the afterlife, like a particularly disturbing version of those CEO autobiographies, where they explain their success principles without acknowledging their privileged starting position or exploitation of workers. The evidence for Egypt's trafficking economy isn't hidden in obscure archaeological findings. It's prominently displayed in museums worldwide. Those beautiful wall paintings showing foreigners in distinctive dress, carrying goods, or performing labor. Those are trafficking victims. Those triumphant royal inscriptions describing military campaigns. They're actually acquisition reports for human property. Those administrative papyri listing household assets. They include people alongside furniture and livestock. We've been looking at evidence of systematic trafficking for centuries while stubbornly refusing to see it for what it is. Modern scholarship has begun confronting these uncomfortable truths, but popular understanding lags behind. Textbooks still describe pyramid builders as workers without acknowledging their unfree status. Movies depict Egyptian life with enslaved people as background scenery rather than economic foundation. Tourist literature describes monuments as national achievements rather than products of coerced labor. This isn't just historical inaccuracy, it's ongoing participation in Egypt's remarkably successful propaganda campaign. They designed their monuments and art to obscure the human suffering that created them, and we're still falling for it thousands of years later. The ethical implications extend beyond historical accuracy. By sanitizing Egyptian trafficking, we create artificial distance between civilized past societies and contemporary exploitation. We condemn modern trafficking while normalizing ancient variants as cultural practices worthy of admiration. This arbitrary moral distinction doesn't emerge from evidence, but from our psychological need to separate what we admire from what we condemn. It's like being horrified by modern sweatshops while wearing a t-shirt with a pyramid on it, a monument built through systematized exploitation that somehow gets a historical pass. What makes this historical amnesia particularly ironic is that the Egyptians themselves didn't hide their trafficking activities. They documented them extensively, proudly, publicly. Temple walls show bound captives presented to gods. Royal inscriptions boast of capture numbers. Administrative texts track human inventory with bureaucratic precision. The Egyptians weren't ashamed of their trafficking economy. They celebrated it as evidence of divine favor and royal power. Our discomfort with these practices is entirely modern, reflecting our values rather than theirs. The archaeological evidence becomes particularly powerful when examining labor sites rather than elite contexts. Worker villages near pyramids and temples tell stories of controlled movement, standardized rations, and physical coercion. Skeletal remains show bodies broken by impossible tasks, compressed vertebrae, arthritic joints in young adults, improperly healed injuries. Graffiti left by workers sometimes names overseers known for cruelty. These aren't interpretive stretches, but direct evidence of unfree labor conditions supporting Egypt's monumental building projects. Understanding Egypt's trafficking economy doesn't diminish their architectural or artistic achievements. It contextualizes them. The pyramids remain remarkable engineering feats. The temples still showcase extraordinary craftsmanship, but recognizing the human cost of these achievements adds necessary dimension to our understanding. We can acknowledge both the impressive results and the exploitation that enabled them, just as we might appreciate a cathedral's beauty while acknowledging problematic aspects of medieval Christianity. Honest history requires holding these complexities simultaneously rather than choosing selective amnesia. Perhaps most disturbing is how Egyptian trafficking methods established patterns that would reappear throughout history. The bureaucratic management of human property, the physical marking of the unfree, the psychological conditioning through religious justification, the transformation of people into inheritable assets. These techniques would resurface in later trafficking systems worldwide. Egypt didn't just build monuments that influenced architecture. They developed exploitation methods that would shape human trafficking for millennia. Their innovations in human control proved as enduring as their pyramids. Some might argue that applying modern ethical standards to ancient practices constitutes anachronistic judgment. But this argument itself reveals selective moral relativism. We don't hesitate to condemn ancient human sacrifice, gladiatorial combat, or ritual murder. We readily judge certain past practices as wrong regardless of their cultural context. Yet systematic human trafficking somehow receives historical immunity, particularly when associated with civilizations we admire for their artistic or architectural achievements. This inconsistency reveals more about our psychological biases than about legitimate historical methodology. The legacy of Egypt's trafficking economy extends into our contemporary understanding of achievement itself. We still tend to marvel at monumental outcomes while ignoring exploitative processes. We admire the gleaming corporate headquarters without questioning the labor conditions of those who built it or work within it. We celebrate entrepreneurial genius without examining the human cost of production methods. The Egyptian model of obscuring exploitation beneath impressive results remains remarkably effective, not because their propaganda was particularly sophisticated, but because we remain willing participants in our own misdirection. Recognizing Egypt's trafficking economy doesn't require rejecting their cultural contributions or artistic achievements. It simply means seeing them completely rather than selectively. It means acknowledging that those magnificent temples were built by people who had no choice in the matter, that those beautiful tomb paintings were created by artists who couldn't refuse the commission, that those impressive agricultural surpluses came from fields worked by unfree hands. Complete history requires confronting uncomfortable truths alongside the aspects we find easier to admire. The final irony: Egypt's trafficking economy ultimately contributed to their civilization's decline. Systems built on exploitation eventually face the mathematical reality of diminishing returns. The administrative overhead of controlling unfree populations, the military resources required for acquisition raids, the reduced innovation from coerced rather than motivated labor. These factors gradually undermined the very civilization built on trafficking foundations. Even the most sophisticated exploitation system eventually consumes itself, a historical lesson as relevant today as it was 3,000 years ago. When we look at ancient Egypt through this more complete lens, what emerges isn't a simplistic moral condemnation, but a more complex understanding of how human achievement has often been built upon human exploitation. The pyramids don't become less impressive when we acknowledge the trafficking that created them, but they do become more honest monuments, testifying not just to engineering skill, but to the full range of human capacity for both creation and cruelty, for both architectural genius and administrative exploitation. Perhaps true appreciation requires seeing both simultaneously: the achievement and its cost, the beauty and its price, the monument and the invisible hands that built it.